The chains screamed against the stone floor, and every guard outside the door took one step back. Inside the lowest chamber of Blackthorn Castle, King Kellen Vane dropped to his knees as another wave of pain tore through his chest. The silver links wrapped around his wrists glowed faintly, biting into his skin, holding back the force that lived inside him. He gritted his teeth and did not cry out. He had not cried out in 7 years, not once, no matter how deep the metal cut. Above him, torches flickered against damp stone walls. The room smelled of iron and old smoke. This was the place where the most powerful Alpha King in the Northern Territories had chosen to lock himself away, far from his people, far from anyone who might get hurt. Captain Garrick stood outside the heavy door, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword out of habit rather than need. No blade could stop what was inside that room if it ever broke free. Only the chains could do that, and even they were beginning to wear thin. "He is quiet tonight," whispered a young guard beside him, a boy named Finn, who had only been posted to the West Wing a month ago. "Quiet is not the same as calm," Garrick said. "Never mistake the two." Finn swallowed and said nothing more. 2 floors above the chained king, in a room lit by candlelight and lined with old maps of the Northern Territories, Lord Alistair Thorne paced in front of a cold hearth. He was the head of the king's council, a tall man, with silver at his temples, and a voice that carried authority even in a whisper. 7 years, he muttered to the 2 counselors seated near him. 7 years. We have propped up a kingdom, with a king who will not leave a locked room. The border packs grow bolder. Raiders strike our outer villages, and no one answers with the strength this pack once had. How much longer can we hide behind his name while he hides behind stone? He still commands the loyalty of the pack, said one of the counselors, a thin woman named Odette. The people believe he protects them by staying locked away. If word ever spread of what really happened that night, that loyalty would crumble. Then let us hope word never spreads, Thorne said, though something in his tone suggested he was not entirely displeased by the thought. He glanced toward the window, toward the dark shape of the West Wing, barely visible against the night sky. A king who cannot rule is no king at all. Sooner or later, this pack will need someone who can stand in the light instead of hiding in the dark. Odette said nothing, though her eyes lingered on Thorne a moment longer than was comfortable, as though she were trying to read thoughts he had not yet spoken aloud. Neither of them noticed the young healer walking the corridors far below, nor could they have guessed that the choices she was about to make would unravel everything they believed they understood about their chained king. Inside the chamber, Kellen lifted his head. Sweat ran down his temple. His eyes, usually a deep and steady brown, flickered gold for a heartbeat before settling back to human. He hated these nights the most, the nights when the beast pressed hardest against the cage of his own mind, when it clawed at the walls he had built to keep his people safe from himself. 7 years ago, he had been a different man. He had ruled with an open hand, walked among his pack without fear, laughed in the great hall until the rafters rang. Then came the betrayal that no one in the castle spoke of anymore, the poisoned wine, the forced shift, the night his control shattered completely. He remembered very little of what happened after that. He remembered only waking up in chains, his own council standing over him with fear in their eyes, and knowing that whatever he had done, it could never be undone. Since that night, he had chained himself of his own will. No one forced him into that room. He forced himself, because he trusted himself less than anyone. Far above, in a wing of the castle bright with lantern light and the smell of fresh bread, a young woman named Elara Voss stepped through the servants' entrance for the very first time. She was tired, in a way that went past her bones. Her boots were caked with mud from 3 days of walking, her cloak torn at the hem, her dark hair pulled back in a braid that had mostly come undone. Behind her, the gates of Blackthorn Castle closed with a heavy sound, shutting out the cold night and the memory of the burned village she had left behind. Her home, a small border pack called Ashwell, no longer existed. Raiders had come at dawn, moving through the village faster than anyone could organize a defense, and by the time the sun set, there was nothing left but smoke and silence. Elara remembered running through the trees with old Mira, the pack's herbalist who had taught her everything she knew about healing, until Mira's steps had slowed, and then stopped altogether, telling Elara to keep going, to not look back. Elara had obeyed, though the guilt of leaving her behind sat heavy in her chest every mile since. She had walked for 3 days after that, sleeping in ditches, eating whatever she could forage, following rumors passed between other displaced travelers about a stronghold in the north that still stood strong, still turned away raiders, still had walls thick enough to keep its people safe. Blackthorn, she had arrived with nothing but her satchel of herbs and bandages, and a quiet, stubborn hope that somewhere in the world there was still a place worth reaching. "You there," called a woman's voice, sharp but not unkind. "Are you the healer they sent word about?" Ilara turned to see a stout woman with flour on her apron and keys jingling at her waist. "Yes," Ilara said. "My name is Ilara Voss. I was told there might be work here." "Work, yes. Kitchens first, healing later, if you prove steady," the woman said. "I am Dessa. I run this house below the stairs. Follow me, and follow the rules, and you will do fine here." Ilara nodded and followed her through a maze of stone corridors, past kitchens loud with clattering pots, past storerooms stacked high with grain, until they reached a small chamber with a narrow bed and a single window facing the courtyard. "This is yours," Dessa said. "Rest tonight. Tomorrow you start early." Before she left, Dessa paused at the door, her expression shifting into something more serious. "One thing, girl. Whatever noises you hear at night, whatever anyone tells you about the West Wing, you stay away from it. Do you understand me?" Ilara frowned. "What is in the West Wing?" "Nothing that concerns a kitchen girl," Dessa said, and closed the door before Ilara could ask anything else. Ilara sat on the edge of the narrow bed for a long moment, staring at the window. She had heard stories on the road, whispered by travelers around campfires, about the Alpha King of Blackthorn. Some called him a hero, who had saved his pack from a war no one else could have won. Others called him a monster, chained away for a crime too terrible to name. She had not known which story to believe. She still did not know, but something about the warning in Dessa's voice, the way her eyes had darted toward the west corridor before she spoke, planted a small seed of curiosity that would not leave Ilara alone. She told herself she would not go near it. She had lost enough already. She did not need more trouble. 3 days passed in a blur of kitchen work. Ilara scrubbed floors, carried water, chopped vegetables until her fingers ached, and slowly began to learn the rhythms of the castle. She learned which guards were kind, and which ones barely looked at the serving staff at all. She learned that meals for the king were prepared separately, carried by only 2 trusted guards, and never eaten in the great hall. She learned that no one, not even the oldest servants, had seen the king's face in years. On the 3rd day, a stable hand named Rowan slipped on wet stone and came down hard on his hand, snapping a finger back at an angle that made 2 other workers turn pale. Ilara was carrying a basket of onions across the courtyard when she heard the shout of pain. She dropped the basket without thinking and rushed to his side, ignoring the surprised looks of the other servants. "Let me see it," she said, already kneeling beside him. "You are a kitchen girl," one of the older stable hands said doubtfully. "Best wait for the healer." "I am a healer," Ilara said, more firmly than she intended. "Or I was, before I came here. Let me see his hand." She examined the break with steady fingers, feeling for the angle of the bone beneath the swelling skin. Rowan hissed in pain, but did not pull away. With calm, practiced movements, she set the finger back into place, splinted it with a strip of cloth and a flat piece of wood taken from a nearby crate, and instructed him to keep it elevated and still for the next several days. Word of the incident traveled quickly through the servants' quarters. By evening, the head healer of the castle, an older woman named Bettina, sought Ilara out personally to ask about her training. Impressed by what she heard, Bettina agreed to let Ilara assist in the small healing hall twice a week, a rare opportunity for someone so new to the castle. It was small, that shift in her days, but it mattered. It gave Ilara a sense of purpose beyond simply surviving, a reminder that her hands were good for something other than carrying grief. And yet even with this new purpose, even with the comfort of Bettina's healing hall, and the friendship growing between herself and Talia, the sound she had heard on her first night in the West Wing continued to echo somewhere in the back of her mind, refusing to be forgotten. On the 4th night, unable to sleep, Ilara wandered the halls near her chamber, restless with the strange energy that came from grief she had not yet let herself feel. She told herself she only wanted air. She found herself instead standing at the top of a narrow staircase she had never noticed before, one that spiraled down into darkness, toward the west wing. A low sound reached her ears. At first she thought it was the wind moving through old stone, but the sound came again, deeper this time, and unmistakably alive. It was not a growl of anger, it was something closer to pain, low and long, the kind of sound a wounded animal makes when it believes no one is listening. Ilara's healer instincts, the ones that had guided her through burns and broken bones and fevers that would not break, rose up before her fear could stop them. She took one step down the staircase, then another. A hand caught her arm. "You should not be here," said a voice behind her. She turned to find a guard, older than Finn, his face lined with years of standing watch over something he clearly feared. "This corridor is forbidden to all servants. Go back to your quarters." "I heard something," Ilara said. "Someone is in pain." The guard's expression tightened. "That is none of your concern. Go back, or I will have to report you to Dessa." Ilara hesitated, glancing once more down the dark staircase. The sound had stopped, but she could still feel it somehow, a weight pressing against her chest that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with an urge she could not explain. She let the guard lead her back to the main hallway, but she did not stop thinking about that sound for the rest of the night. The next morning, she asked Dessa carefully, choosing her words with as much innocence as she could manage, what exactly was kept in the west wing. Dessa's hands stilled over the bread dough she was kneading. For a moment, Ilara thought she would not answer at all. "The king," Dessa finally said, so quietly that Ilara almost missed it. "The king is kept there." "Kept," Ilara repeated. "You mean he lives there?" "I mean he is chained there," Dessa said, and there was old sorrow in her voice, not just fear. 7 years now, ever since the night everything went wrong. He does not come out. He does not let anyone near him, not healers, not his own council, no one. The guards bring his meals and leave. That is the whole of it. Why would a king chain himself? Ilara asked, though part of her already suspected the answer had something to do with the story she had heard on the road. Dessa looked up, and for the first time, Ilara saw real fear in the older woman's eyes. Fear mixed with something that looked almost like loyalty. Because he believes he is dangerous. Because something happened once. Something none of us speak of, and he has never forgiven himself for it. Whatever you heard last night, whatever you think you understand, leave it alone, Ilara. That door has stayed shut for good reason. Ilara nodded slowly, but the seed of curiosity that had been planted the night before had already begun to grow into something stronger, something she could not yet name. Over the following days, she threw herself into her work, trying to push the strange pull from her mind. She helped an injured stable hand set a broken finger, impressing the head healer enough to be given more responsibility. She learned the names of the other servants, shared quiet meals with a young laundry maid named Talia, who seemed to know everything happening in the castle before anyone else did. It was Talia who told her more, in hushed tones over a shared bowl of stew, about the night 7 years ago. "They say his own council poisoned his wine," Talia whispered. "Wanted him weak, wanted him controlled, so they could rule through him, instead of beside him. Only it went wrong. The poison did not weaken him. It broke something inside him instead, some wall that kept the wolf and the man apart. When he came back to himself, there was blood everywhere, and he has not forgiven himself since." "Do you believe that story?" Ilara asked. Talia shrugged. "I believe he has not hurt a soul in 7 years, chained in that room by his own choice. If he were truly a monster, would he not have broken free by now? Would the chains truly hold a monster who wanted to be free?" The question lingered in Ilara's mind long after Talia had gone to bed. She lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of her small chamber, thinking about the sound she had heard, the pain in it, the way it had felt less like the growl of a beast, and more like the cry of someone utterly alone. She thought of her own losses, the village burned to ash, the faces of neighbors she would never see again, the grief she had not allowed herself to feel because there had been no time, only running, only survival. Perhaps that was why the sound had struck her so deeply. Perhaps she recognized something of her own pain in it. On the 7th night since her arrival, unable to bear the restlessness any longer, Ilara rose from her bed, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and made her way once more toward the narrow staircase that led to the west wing. This time, she moved carefully, staying close to the shadows, avoiding the paths where guards typically walked their rounds. She had learned the rhythm of the castle well enough now to know when the watch changed, when the corridors emptied for a few precious minutes. The staircase was cold beneath her bare feet. She descended slowly, one hand trailing along the rough stone wall, her heart beating fast with a mixture of fear and something she could only describe as purpose. The deeper she went, the more the air seemed to change, growing heavier, thick with the scent of old iron, and something else, something wild and untamed, that she could not name. At the bottom of the stairs, a single torch burned in a bracket on the wall, casting long shadows across a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands. 2 guards stood before it, but they were turned away, murmuring quietly to each other about something unrelated to their post. Their attention drifted just enough. Ilara pressed herself into the shadow of an alcove and waited, watching, her breath shallow. And then she heard it again, the same sound from before, low and full of a pain that seemed to reach into her chest and pull. She did not decide to move. Her feet simply carried her forward, past the distracted guards, toward the door, driven by something stronger than reason, stronger than fear, stronger than every warning she had been given since she arrived at Blackthorn. Her hand found the edge of the door. It was not locked from the outside, she realized with surprise. It did not need to be. Whatever was inside was held by something far stronger than any lock. Inside the chamber, Kellen had not moved from the floor. His breathing had steadied, though sweat still clung to his brow, and his shirt hung open at the collar, damp against his skin. He kept his eyes closed, focusing on the slow, deliberate rhythm of his own heartbeat, the way he had trained himself to do on nights when the wolf pressed too close to the surface. He had learned, over 7 long years, exactly how to survive the worst hours of the night. He had never once learned how to hope for anything better. He heard the door before he saw it, the faint creak of old hinges, a sound so unfamiliar in that chamber that for a moment he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. No one entered that room. No one had entered that room in years, not since the healers had given up trying and the guards had learned to simply leave trays of food outside and knock twice before retreating. He lifted his head slowly, his gold-flecked eyes catching the dim torchlight, expecting to see nothing at all. Instead, he saw her. A young woman stood just inside the doorway, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, a plain shawl wrapped tight against the cold of the chamber. She was not a guard. She was not a healer, he recognized. She carried no weapon, no vial of silver dust, nothing that marked her as someone sent to control him. She simply stood there, her eyes wide, not with the fear he had grown so used to seeing, but with something closer to concern. "You should not be here," he said, his voice rough from disuse, lower and rougher than he intended. "Leave, now, before it is too late." Ilara did not move. Her heart pounded so hard she was certain he could hear it, but something kept her rooted to the spot. Some instinct that told her the danger everyone had warned her about was not the danger standing in front of her. The man before her, chained hand and foot to the stone wall, looked less like a monster, and more like someone who had been suffering in silence for far too long. Someone the world had decided to forget. "I heard you," she said quietly. "I have heard you for days now, through the walls. I could not stay away any longer." "You do not understand what I am," Kellen said, and for the first time in years, there was something other than command in his voice. There was warning, yes, but beneath it, buried deep, there was also something that sounded almost like fear, not for himself, but for her. "Go back upstairs. Forget this room exists. That is the only way to stay safe." Ilara took a small step forward instead of backward, her healer's instincts refusing to let her walk away from someone in pain, chained or not. "I am not afraid of you," she said, though her voice trembled slightly as she said it. "You should be," Kellen said, and closed his eyes again, bracing for the moment she would surely turn and run, as everyone before her always had. But Ilara did not run. She stepped closer instead, slowly, carefully, her eyes never leaving his, until she was near enough to see the raw, silver-burned skin beneath the heavy chains wrapped around his wrists, near enough to see just how much pain he had been enduring, alone, in the dark, for longer than she could imagine. And then, without a single word of warning, she reached out and pressed her bare palm gently against the cold, silver-laced chain. The chamber fell utterly silent. Nothing happened, No burn seared her skin. No cry of pain escaped her lips. The chain that had scorched every healer, every guard, every careless hand that had ever come near it in 7 long years, simply sat beneath her palm, cool and quiet, as though it recognized something in her touch that it had never recognized in anyone else. Kellen's breath caught in his throat. His golden eyes snapped fully open, fixed on her hand resting against the chain, against him, and for the first time since the night everything had gone wrong, the beast inside him did not rage. It went utterly, impossibly still. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Elara kept her palm pressed against the chain, watching the way Kellen's chest rose and fell, slower now, steadier than it had been moments before. His golden eyes had not left her hand. "How?" he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you doing that?" "Doing what?" Elara asked, though she could feel it too, a strange warmth beneath her palm that had nothing to do with the cold stone room around them. "That chain has burned every hand that has come near it. For 7 years, Kellen said. Guards, healers, my own council, once, when they tried to move me during a fever. It should be burning you now, it is not." Elara looked down at her hand, then back up at him, searching his face for the monster everyone in the castle had warned her about. She did not find one. She found only a tired man, with deep shadows beneath his eyes, and a wariness that seemed carved into every line of his face. "I do not know why," she admitted honestly. "I only know that I heard someone in pain, and I could not walk away from that. I am a healer, it is what I do." "You should not have come here," Kellen said again, though the force behind the words had softened considerably. "If the guards find you in this room, they will drag you out, and likely have you dismissed from the castle, or worse. And if I lose control, even for a moment, I could hurt you before either of us understood what was happening. You need to leave, please." The word please, spoken by a man everyone described as untouchable and dangerous, struck Elara harder than any warning had. She slowly withdrew her hand from the chain, and the moment her palm lifted away, Kellen seemed to deflate slightly, as though something warm had left the room with her touch. "I will go," she said, "but I do not believe you are what they say you are." Before Kellen could respond, heavy footsteps sounded in the corridor outside, followed by raised voices. The 2 guards who had been distracted moments earlier were now very much alert, having noticed the door slightly ajar, and a shape moving inside that should not have been there. "Someone is in the king's chamber," one of them shouted. Elara barely had time to step back before the door swung open fully, and Garrick himself appeared, sword drawn, his eyes widening in disbelief at the sight before him. A servant girl, standing calmly beside the chained king, her hand having just been resting on the very chains that had scarred stronger men than her. "Get away from him," Garrick ordered, moving quickly to place himself between Elara and the king, though his eyes darted uncertainly toward Kellen, waiting for any sign of the violence he expected to erupt. "She is not in danger," Kellen said quietly, surprising everyone in the room, including himself. "Let her leave. Do not harm her." Garrick hesitated, clearly torn between his duty to protect the girl from the king and his instinct to obey the king's direct order. In the end, years of loyalty won out. He nodded once, sharply, and gestured for Elara to follow him out of the chamber. As she reached the doorway, Elara glanced back one final time. Kellen was watching her, his expression unreadable, though something in his eyes looked almost like longing, quickly hidden behind the same guarded wall he had worn since she first stepped into the room. "Thank you," he said quietly, so quietly she almost did not hear it, for not being afraid. Elara did not answer. She simply nodded, once, before Garrick guided her firmly back up the narrow staircase and away from the west wing. The rest of that night passed in a blur. Garrick escorted her directly to Dessa's quarters, waking the older woman with an urgency that immediately set the whole household on edge. Dessa's face went pale when she heard where Elara had been found, and paler still when Garrick explained, in careful, measured words, that the girl had touched the silver chains without harm. "That is not possible," Dessa said, staring at Elara as though seeing her for the first time. "No one touches those chains, no one." "I know what I saw," Garrick said grimly. "The king himself ordered her released unharmed. I have never known him to speak a full sentence to anyone in 7 years, let alone show mercy towards someone who broke into his chamber. Dessa turned to Alara, her expression a complicated mixture of fear, confusion, and something that looked almost like hope. "Girl, do you understand what you have done? The whole castle will be talking about this by morning." "I did not mean to cause trouble," Alara said quietly. "I only wanted to help." "Help," Dessa repeated, shaking her head slowly. "Child, you may have just done something no healer, no council member, no soldier has managed to do in 7 years. Whether that is help or disaster, I cannot yet say." News of the encounter spread through Blackthorn Castle, exactly as Dessa had predicted, faster than any of them expected. By the time the sun rose over the courtyard, servants were whispering the story in every corridor, embellishing it with each retelling, until it barely resembled what had actually happened. Some said the kitchen girl had walked straight through fire to reach the king. Others claimed she had tamed the beast with a single word. A few, more cautious than the rest, simply said that something had changed within those stone walls, something that had not changed in 7 long years. Lord Alistair Thorne heard the news over his morning meal, and his fork paused halfway to his mouth as Odette relayed the account, her voice tight with barely contained alarm. "A servant girl touched the chains and remained unharmed," Odette said. "The guards confirm it. Even Garrick will not deny it." Thorne set down his fork slowly, his expression carefully neutral, though his mind was already turning over the implications of what he had just heard. A king who could not be touched by anyone, suddenly touched without harm, by an unknown healer with no family, no connections, no history within the pack. It was either the greatest miracle Blackthorn had seen in years, or the greatest threat to the careful balance of power Thorne had spent 7 years building in the king's absence. "Find out everything you can about this girl," Thorne said finally. "Where she came from, who her family was, whether she has any allies within these walls. I want to know everything before the council meets to discuss this." "You believe it is dangerous," Odette said. "I believe," Thorne said carefully, "that anything capable of changing what has remained unchanged for 7 years deserves very close attention." Meanwhile, deep in the west wing, Kellen sat with his back against the cold stone wall, staring at the chain Alara had touched hours earlier. He turned his wrist slowly, examining the silver links that had burned him countless times over the years, expecting to feel the familiar sting he had grown so accustomed to. He felt nothing but the faint, lingering warmth of a memory that refused to leave him. He had spent 7 years convincing himself that he deserved this isolation, that the safety of his people depended entirely on his continued confinement. He had built his entire existence around the belief that nothing and no one could reach him without being harmed in return. And then, in the space of a few short minutes, a stranger with quiet eyes and steady hands had proven that belief wrong. It terrified him more than he cared to admit. By midday, Garrick arrived at the chamber door, as he did every day, carrying a simple meal of bread and dried meat. He set the tray down carefully, watching Kellen with the same careful attention he always gave, searching for any sign of instability. "The council wishes to speak with you," Garrick said, "about the incident last night." "There is nothing to discuss," Kellen said. "The girl should not have entered this room. See that it does not happen again." Garrick studied him a moment longer than usual. "With respect, my king, in 7 years I have never seen the chains fail to burn anyone who touched them. Not once. Whatever happened last night, the council will want answers, and so, I suspect, will you, eventually." Kellen said nothing, though long after Garrick had left, the words lingered in his mind, alongside the memory of a warm palm pressed against cold silver, and the strange, unfamiliar stillness that had settled over the beast within him for the first time in 7 long years. That evening, word reached Alara that she was to report to the small council chamber the following morning. Dessa delivered the message with a worried frown, urging Alara to say as little as possible, and to avoid drawing any further attention to herself. "They will ask you many questions," Dessa warned. "Answer only what you must. Do not mention how you felt, or what you believed you saw in him. Councils like Lord Thorne's do not concern themselves with feelings. They concern themselves with control." Alara nodded, though sleep did not come easily that night. She lay awake in her narrow bed, replaying the moment again and again in her mind, the warmth beneath her palm, the golden flicker in his eyes, the quiet, broken gratitude in his voice as she left. Whatever the council decided, whatever punishment or warning awaited her in the morning, she could not shake the certainty that had settled deep in her chest. The man chained in the West Wing was not the monster everyone believed him to be, and somehow, without meaning to, she had become tangled in a mystery that reached far deeper than anyone in Blackthorn Castle yet understood. Morning came too quickly. Alara, dressed in the cleanest clothes she owned, tied her hair back with careful hands that trembled only slightly, and followed a stern-faced guard through corridors she had never walked before, up toward the higher levels of the castle where the council chamber waited. The room was grand in a way that made Alara feel smaller than she already did, with tall windows letting in pale morning light, and a long table of dark wood surrounded by carved chairs. Lord Alistair Thorne sat at the head of the table, flanked by Odette and two other counselors Alara did not recognize. Garrick stood near the door, his expression carefully neutral, though Alara caught the faint reassurance in his eyes as she entered. "Alara Voss," Thorne said, his voice smooth and measured, the kind of voice that had clearly commanded rooms for many years. "Please, sit." Alara sat, keeping her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. "Tell us," Thorne continued, "exactly what happened last night in the West Wing." Alara chose her words carefully, remembering Dessa's warning. "I heard someone in pain. I am trained as a healer. I could not simply walk past and do nothing." "And when you reached the chamber," Thorne pressed, "what did you do?" "I touched the chain," Alara said simply. "That is all." "That is all," Thorne repeated, a faint, unreadable smile touching his lips. "The chain that has burned every hand that has ever touched it for 7 years. And it did not burn you." "No," Alara said. "It did not." Odette leaned forward slightly. "Do you have any explanation for why that might be?" "None," Alara admitted. "I did not know it would happen until it did." The counselors exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them that Alara could not fully read. Thorne studied her for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, before speaking again. "You understand," he said slowly, "that what you describe has never happened before. Not once, in 7 years, has anyone approached the king's chains without suffering harm. Healers, with far more experience than you have tried. Soldiers with far more courage have tried. All of them failed. Yet a kitchen servant, newly arrived, with no family and no history within these walls, succeeds where they could not. You can understand why that raises questions." "I understand," Alara said quietly, though a flicker of defiance rose in her chest, despite her best efforts to remain calm. "But I did not ask for this to happen. I only wanted to help someone who sounded like they were suffering." "And is that all you found in that chamber?" Thorne asked, his eyes sharp despite his gentle tone. "Suffering? Nothing more?" Alara hesitated, choosing her next words with great care. "I found a man in pain, my lord. Nothing more, nothing less." Thorne held her gaze a moment longer, as though searching for something beneath her carefully composed answer, before finally leaning back in his chair. "Very well. For now, you will return to your duties in the kitchens and the healing hall. You are forbidden from approaching the West Wing again, without explicit permission from this council. Is that understood?" "Yes, my lord," Alara said. "See that it remains understood," Thorne said, dismissing her with a small wave of his hand. Garrick escorted her from the chamber, and once they were safely out of earshot of the closed door, he spoke quietly. "That went better than I expected. Thorne can be far less patient with those he suspects of hiding something." "I was not hiding anything," Alara said. "I know," Garrick said, his expression thoughtful. "But Thorne does not trust easily, especially not anything that threatens the order he has built over the past 7 years. Be careful, Alara. Whatever happened between you and the king last night, it has drawn attention you may not want." Alara nodded, though as she walked back toward the kitchens, her mind was not on Thorne's warning, or the council's suspicion. It was on the memory of golden eyes watching her, with something that looked almost like hope, and a quiet voice thanking her for not being afraid, when everyone else in that castle had been afraid of him for 7 long years. She did not know yet what any of it meant. But she knew, with a certainty she could not explain, that this was not the end of her story with the chained king of Blackthorn. It was only the beginning. That afternoon, Talia found her scrubbing pots in the kitchen, her hands red from hot water, her mind clearly elsewhere. The laundry maid set down a basket of folded linens, and glanced around before leaning in close. "Everyone is talking about you," Talia whispered, equal parts excited and worried. "They say you walked right up to the king, and he did not so much as growl at you. Some of the older servants say it is a sign that the pack's luck is finally turning after 7 years of bad fortune." "I do not know what it is a sign of," Ilara said honestly, scrubbing harder at a stubborn spot on the pot in front of her. "I only know what happened." "And what did happen?" Talia asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. "What is he like, truly?" "Everyone has a different story." Ilara paused, remembering the low, rough voice, the golden eyes, the desperate plea for her to leave before she could be hurt. "He did not seem like a monster," she said slowly. "He seemed like someone who has been alone for a very long time, and has convinced himself that being alone is the only way to keep everyone else safe." Talia was quiet for a moment, studying her friend's face. "You feel sorry for him?" "I do not know what I feel," Ilara admitted. "But I know Thorn has forbidden me from returning to the West Wing, and I know I should listen to that, for my own sake, as much as anyone else's." "Should," Talia repeated, a knowing smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "That is a very careful word, Ilara Voss." Ilara said nothing, though her silence spoke clearly enough. Long after Talia had gone to finish her own chores, Ilara remained at the wash basin, staring down at the water without truly seeing it, her thoughts drifting back to a cold stone chamber far below the castle, and to a man who had thanked her simply for not being afraid. Whatever Thorn's council had decided, whatever rules had been laid down that morning, Ilara already suspected that the pull she felt toward that locked door, and toward the man chained behind it, would not be so easily silenced. 5 days passed before Ilara broke the council's order, and every one of those days felt longer than the last. She kept to her duties exactly as instructed, scrubbing floors, tending the small garden of healing herbs behind the kitchens, assisting Bettina in the healing hall whenever she was needed. She smiled when spoken to, answered questions when asked, and gave every appearance of a young woman who had put the strange incident in the West Wing firmly behind her. But beneath the surface, the pull remained, quiet and constant, like a thread tied somewhere deep in her chest that tugged a little harder each night. On the 6th night, she gave in. She told herself it was only to check on him, to see with her own eyes that the wounds she had glimpsed beneath his chains were not growing worse. She told herself many things as she wrapped a small bundle of healing salve and clean bandages into a cloth and slipped quietly from her room long after the rest of the servants' quarters had gone dark. She did not entirely believe any of the reasons she gave herself, but they were enough to carry her feet down the familiar corridors, toward the narrow staircase she had promised Thorn's council she would avoid. The 2 guards posted outside the chamber door, this time were Garrick and young Finn. Ilara's steps faltered when she saw them, certain she would be turned away immediately, perhaps even reported. Instead, Garrick studied her for a long moment, glanced at the bundle in her hands, and sighed with the weary resignation of a man who had already guessed this night might come. "The council forbade you from coming here," he said quietly. "I know," Ilara said. "I brought salve for his wrists. The chains have burned him for years. Someone should have been treating that damage long ago." Garrick's jaw tightened. He looked toward Finn, who shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing, clearly leaving the decision to his captain. "If Thorn learns of this," Garrick said slowly, "there will be consequences, for both of us." "Then do not let him learn of it," Ilara said, meeting his gaze steadily. "I only wish to help him heal. That is all I have ever wanted." Garrick studied her a moment longer, then stepped aside, just enough to let her pass. "You have 1 hour," he said, "no more. And if anything happens, if I hear even the smallest sign of danger, I will come in immediately, regardless of what the king commands." "Thank you," Ilara said, and slipped past him into the dark stairwell before he could change his mind. The chamber looked much the same as it had the first time she entered it, torchlight flickering against damp stone, chains stretched taut from the wall to the heavy iron cuffs around Kellen's wrists and ankles. He was seated this time, his back against the wall, and when he saw her enter, his entire body went rigid with surprise. "You should not be here," he said, though the words carried none of the sharp warning they had held 5 nights before. "The council forbade it, I heard." "I know what the council said," Ilara replied, kneeling a careful distance away and unwrapping the bundle in her hands. I also know that the wounds beneath these chains have likely never been properly treated in 7 years, and that is simply bad healing practice, regardless of who you are. Kellen stared at her, something between disbelief and reluctant amusement flickering across his tired face. You broke a direct order from the council to lecture me about wound care. I broke a direct order from the council because someone needed to, Alara said simply. May I see your wrists? For a long moment, he did not move. Then, slowly, cautiously, as though testing whether the moment from 5 nights ago had truly been real, he extended one arm toward her, the silver chain rattling softly against stone. Alara's fingers were gentle as she examined the burned, raw skin beneath the cuff, wincing at the sight of scarring that had clearly built up over years of constant friction and silver poisoning. This should have been treated ages ago, she murmured, mostly to herself. No wonder you are always in pain. Pain has become familiar, Kellen said quietly. I stopped noticing it long ago. That does not mean it should be ignored, Alara said, opening the small jar of salve and beginning to apply it carefully to the inflamed skin. Kellen flinched slightly at the first touch, though whether from pain or simple surprise at being touched with such gentle care, Alara could not tell. They sat in silence for a while as she worked, the only sounds the faint crackle of the torch and the soft rustle of cloth as she wrapped clean bandages beneath the cuffs, careful not to loosen the chains that everyone still believed necessary. Why do you keep coming back? Kellen finally asked, watching her work with an intensity that made her fingers tremble slightly, though she did not let it show in the steadiness of her hands. Every instinct you have should be telling you to stay away from this room. Alara considered the question seriously before answering. I lost my home not long ago, she said quietly. Raiders came, and by the end of the day, there was nothing left. I lost people I loved, people who trusted me to help them, and I could not. I promised myself that if I ever had the chance to help someone again, truly help them, I would not let fear stop me. Kellen was quiet for a long moment, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. I am sorry, he said finally, for your loss. As am I, for yours, Alara said, glancing up to meet his eyes. 7 years alone in this room. That is its own kind of loss, is it not? Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the careful wall he had built around himself. I chose this, he said, though there was less conviction in the words than there had been in his warnings the first night. I chose it because I have no right to risk anyone's safety again. What happened 7 years ago? Alara asked gently, finishing the bandage on his second wrist and sitting back slightly to look at him properly. Kellen's expression darkened, old grief surfacing behind his golden-flecked eyes. There was a night, he said slowly, when everything I believed about myself, about my control, about my ability to protect the people I loved, was proven wrong. I do not remember all of it clearly. I remember drinking wine at a council gathering, feeling strange, feeling the wolf claw at the edges of my mind, in a way it never had before. And then I remember waking up hours later, in a room full of blood, with no memory of what I had done. Alara's breath caught, though she did not pull away. Blood, she repeated softly. My own council chamber, Kellen said, his voice hollow. Several guards, injured badly enough that 2 never fully recovered. I was told later that the wine had been poisoned, that someone had wanted me weak enough to control, and instead the poison had shattered whatever control I had over the wolf entirely. But knowing the cause did not undo what happened. It only told me that if it could happen once, unexpectedly, without warning, it could happen again. I chained myself the very next day, and I have not left this room since. Do you believe it could happen again? Alara asked quietly. I do not know, Kellen admitted, and the honesty in his voice struck her deeply. That is the truth no one wants to hear. I do not know if I am dangerous or simply broken. I only know that I would rather live the rest of my life in chains than risk finding out the answer at the cost of someone else's life. Alara sat with that admission for a long moment, feeling the weight of 7 years of isolation settle over the small chamber like a physical thing. And yet, she said slowly, you told the guards not to harm me. You told me to leave, to protect me, not yourself. That does not sound like someone who has lost control of himself. That sounds like someone who has spent 7 years punishing himself for something that was done to him, not something he chose. Kellen looked at her for a long, searching moment, as though no one had ever suggested such a thing to him before, as though the idea itself was almost too foreign to process. "You speak as though you believe me innocent," he said quietly. "I believe," Alara said carefully, "that a betrayal is not the same as a choice. Someone poisoned you. Someone wanted you weak. Whatever happened after that was not truly you, was it?" "It does not matter whether it was truly me," Kellen said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "The people who were hurt do not care about the difference. Neither do I, most days." The hour Garrick had granted her passed too quickly. When his voice sounded softly from the corridor outside, reminding her gently that it was time to leave, Ilara gathered her bundle and rose slowly, reluctant to end the conversation. "I will come back," she said, before she could stop herself. "If you will let me." Kellen studied her, torn between the instinct to send her away for her own safety and something new, something he had not allowed himself to feel in 7 long years. "The chains have never harmed you," he said slowly. "I do not understand why, but I find that I do not want you to stop coming, even though every part of me knows I should insist otherwise." "Then I will come back," Alara said simply, and slipped out into the corridor before he could change his mind, leaving him alone once more, in the flickering torchlight, staring down at wrists wrapped in careful bandages for the first time in 7 long years. Over the following 2 weeks, her visits became a quiet, careful routine. She came only when Garrick or Finn stood watch, always with a reason ready: salve for his wounds, tea to help him sleep, simple conversation to fill the long, empty hours he had endured alone for so long. Slowly, cautiously, Kellen began to speak more freely, sharing small pieces of the man he had been before the poison, before the chains, before 7 years had worn away at whatever hope he once carried. He told her about the pack he remembered leading in his younger years, before the weight of the crown settled fully upon him, when he had still found time to run through the northern forests simply for the joy of feeling the wind against his fur. He told her about his mother, who had died before he took the throne, and how he sometimes wondered what she would think of the man he had become, chained in darkness, ruling a kingdom he could no longer see. Ilara, in turn, shared pieces of her own life: the small border pack of Ashwell, the herbalist named Mira, who had taught her everything she knew, the quiet ache of a home that no longer existed anywhere, except in memory. Neither of them spoke of what was growing between them in that dim stone chamber, though both could feel it, a warmth neither had expected to find in a place built entirely for isolation. But even as their bond deepened in the quiet hours of stolen visits, above them, in the bright halls of Blackthorn Castle, Lord Alistair Thorne had not forgotten the strange incident that had disrupted 7 years of careful order, and he had not stopped watching. He had sent a rider to the border regions days earlier, instructed to learn everything possible about the fallen pack of Ashwell and the healer who claimed to have come from it. The rider returned on a gray morning, with little to report, only that Ashwell had indeed been destroyed by raiders weeks earlier, and that survivors had scattered in every direction, most never to be accounted for. There was no unusual history to find, no hidden bloodline, no obvious explanation for why a simple village healer would be immune to silver that had burned trained soldiers. "Nothing," Thorne said, more to himself than to Odette, who stood across from him in his private study, reading over the rider's brief report. "No family of note, no known gift, nothing that explains what happened in that chamber." "Perhaps there is no explanation," Odette offered carefully. "Perhaps it was simply chance." "I do not believe in chance," Thorne said. "Not when it comes to silver-bound chains that have never once failed in 7 years. Something about that girl is different, and I intend to learn what it is before it becomes a problem this council cannot control." "You still see her as a threat," Odette said. "I see her as unpredictable," Thorne corrected. "And unpredictable things, in a kingdom already balanced as precariously as ours, tend to become threats eventually, whether they mean to or not. Keep a closer watch on her movements. Quietly. I do not wish to alarm her. Not yet." Odette nodded, though privately she wondered whether Thorne's concern was truly for the stability of the kingdom, or for the quiet, careful power he had built for himself in the king's long absence, power that a healed and returning king would surely take back into his own hands. Meanwhile, in the healing hall, Alara continued her daily work, unaware of the watchful eyes that had begun following her more closely through the castle's corridors. Bettina, the head healer, had grown fond of her new assistant, praising her steady hands and calm manner with patience, never suspecting that the same steady hands spent several nights each week, tending wounds far more dangerous than any brought before the healing hall's public tables. One afternoon, while grinding herbs for a fever remedy, Bettina mentioned offhandedly that she had once, many years earlier, been called to treat the king before his confinement began. He was a different man then, Bettina said, almost wistfully, not noticing the way Alara's hands stilled over the mortar and pestle. Warm, quick to laugh, he used to walk among the pack without guards, without fear, greeting even the lowest servants by name. It is hard to imagine that same man locked away in the dark for 7 years. Do you believe the stories? Alara asked carefully. That he is dangerous? Bettina considered the question for a long moment. I believe something terrible happened to him, she said finally. Whether that makes him dangerous or simply broken, I could not say. I only know that a kind heart does not disappear overnight, even under the worst of circumstances. Somewhere beneath whatever chains him now, I suspect that same man is still there, waiting. Alara said nothing, though the words settled deep in her chest, echoing thoughts she had not yet dared to voice aloud, even to herself. That night, when she slipped down to the west wing once more, she found Kellen in better spirits than she had yet seen him, sitting up straighter, his eyes clearer, the raw wounds beneath his wrists visibly healing, thanks to 2 weeks of careful treatment. You look stronger, she observed, settling into her now familiar spot across from him. I feel stronger, Kellen admitted, turning his wrist slightly to examine the healing skin beneath the chain. I had almost forgotten what it felt like to be without constant pain. You have given me that, at least. It is only proper wound care, Alara said, though warmth rose in her cheeks at the gratitude in his voice. It is more than that, Kellen said quietly, and we both know it. The silence that followed was heavier than usual, charged with something neither of them had yet named. Alara busied herself with unwrapping a small bundle of dried herbs, avoiding his gaze, though she could feel it resting on her steadily. Alara, Kellen said, and something in the way he spoke her name, careful and deliberate, made her look up despite herself. Why did the chain never burn you? Truly, I have thought of little else these past 2 weeks. I do not know, Alara admitted honestly. I have wondered the same thing myself, every single night since it happened. There are old stories, Kellen said slowly, among our kind, of bonds that transcend even silver. Bonds between mates that no ordinary force can break or harm. I dismissed such stories long ago as legend, comforting tales told to pups before sleep. But I confess, since that first night, I have found myself wondering whether legend and truth are always so easily separated. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. She had heard whispers of such bonds too, growing up in Ashwell, stories of a connection so deep that 2 souls simply recognized each other on sight, a bond stronger than blood, stronger than fear, stronger even than the silver meant to control a wolf's most dangerous instincts. She had never truly believed such a thing existed outside of stories meant to comfort lonely hearts. That is a very large claim, she said carefully, though her heart was pounding. I am not making a claim, Kellen said, equally careful. I am only wondering aloud, in the company of the one person who has ever made me feel less like a monster in 7 long years. Neither of them spoke further on the matter that night, though the question hung between them long after Alara had gathered her things and slipped back into the darkened corridors above, carrying with her a new and unsettling possibility that she was not yet ready to fully accept. 3 nights later, her routine nearly ended in disaster. She had just reached the bottom of the narrow staircase, her bundle of fresh bandages tucked beneath her shawl, when she heard voices coming from the wrong direction entirely, not from Garrick or Finn, but from somewhere further down the corridor, closer to the chamber door than she had ever encountered anyone besides the usual watch. She froze in the shadow of the stairwell, straining to listen. I do not care what the schedule says, came a voice she recognized immediately, as belonging to one of Thorne's personal attendants, a sharp-featured man named Corwin, who rarely ventured this deep into the castle. Lord Thorne wishes to inspect the chamber himself tonight, unannounced. He believes the guards have grown careless in their duties. Ilara's heart slammed against her ribs. If Corwin found her here, past the hour Thorne had explicitly forbidden, There would be no explanation steady enough to protect her, or Garrick, who had risked so much already, by allowing her visits to continue. She pressed herself deeper into the alcove shadow, barely breathing, as Corwin's footsteps echoed closer. Ahead, she heard Garrick's voice rise in response, deliberately loud, clearly trying to buy time. "The king is resting," Garrick said firmly. An unannounced inspection at this hour could agitate him unnecessarily. Surely this can wait until morning, when Lord Thorn himself is present. Lord Thorn's orders were clear, Corwin replied coldly. "Step aside." Alara's mind raced. There was no way back up the staircase without passing directly in Corwin's line of sight, and no way forward without walking straight into the confrontation unfolding at the chamber door. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall, forcing herself to remain perfectly still, every instinct screaming at her to run, despite there being nowhere safe to run to. Inside the chamber, unaware of the danger unfolding just beyond his door, Kellen had gone very still, his heightened senses picking up the tension in Garrick's raised voice, the unfamiliar scent of a stranger approaching his chamber for the first time in years. His wolf stirred uneasily beneath the surface, sensing danger to the one person who had spent 2 weeks proving, again and again, that she meant him no harm. Just as Corwin reached for the chamber door, a loud crash echoed from somewhere further down the corridor, the unmistakable sound of a supply cart tipping over, wood splintering against stone. Corwin whirled toward the noise, cursing under his breath. "See to that," he snapped at Finn, who had appeared seemingly from nowhere, his expression carefully innocent despite the guilty flush creeping up his neck. Alara realized, with a rush of gratitude, that Finn had deliberately created the distraction, buying precious seconds. While Corwin's attention was diverted, Garrick's eyes found the shadowed alcove where Alara stood frozen, and with the smallest jerk of his head, he signaled toward a narrow servant's passage she had not noticed before, tucked behind a tapestry a few steps away. She moved as quietly as she could manage, heart pounding so loudly she was certain it would give her away, and slipped through the gap just as Corwin turned back from the commotion, his patience clearly worn thin. "I do not have time for this incompetence," Corwin snapped. "Fine. The inspection will happen tomorrow, properly scheduled, with the full council present. But do not think this matter is forgotten." He stormed off down the corridor, his footsteps fading into silence, and only then did Alara allow herself to breathe again, pressed into the narrow darkness of the servants' passage, her whole body trembling with the aftermath of fear. It took several long minutes before Garrick came to find her, his expression grim in the torchlight. "That was too close," he said quietly. "Thorn is growing suspicious. If Corwin had opened that door even a few moments earlier, I do not know how any of us would have explained your presence." "I am sorry," Alara whispered. "I did not mean to put you or Finn at risk. We chose this, Locker," Garrick said simply. "But you should know, Alara, this cannot continue forever without consequence. Sooner or later, Thorn will find a way to see what is truly happening down here, and when he does, I fear none of us will be able to protect you from what follows." Alara nodded slowly, the weight of his warning settling heavily over her as she made her way back to her quarters that night, the adrenaline of the near discovery still coursing through her veins long after she had climbed into her narrow bed. She thought of Kellen, alone once more in his chamber, and of the strange, unfamiliar bond growing between them that neither silver nor secrecy seemed able to fully contain. Whatever was happening between them, she realized, was no longer simply her choice to make. Forces far larger than a stolen hour in a candlelit chamber had already begun to notice, and time, she suspected, was running out far faster than either of them wanted to believe. The formal inspection took place the following evening, exactly as Corwin had promised, and this time, there was no distraction clever enough to prevent it. Lord Thorn arrived at the chamber door flanked by 2 counselors and 4 guards, his expression carefully composed, though Garrick recognized the sharp glint of suspicion in his eyes immediately. Alara had been warned in advance and stayed far from the west wing that night, though she paced her small room restlessly, unable to shake the fear that somehow, some way, the truth of her visits would surface regardless. Inside the chamber, Kellen sat calmly against the wall, his expression giving away nothing, as Thorn stepped through the door for the first time in nearly a year. "My king," Thorn said, his tone carrying the practiced respect of a man who had grown accustomed to ruling in another's name. I trust you are well. As well as can be expected, Kellen replied evenly, chained in a stone room for 7 years. Thorne's lips twitched faintly, though whether from amusement or irritation, Kellen could not tell. I have come to discuss a troubling matter. A servant girl was found in this chamber some weeks ago, in direct violation of council orders, forbidding anyone from approaching without express permission. I understand she has continued to visit since, against those same orders. Kellen kept his expression neutral, though inwardly he weighed his next words carefully, aware that whatever he said next could determine Alara's safety far more than his own. The girl treated wounds that no one else has bothered to treat in 7 years, he said finally. If that is a crime worth punishing, then perhaps this council should examine its own neglect first. Neglect? Thorne repeated coolly. Or caution, my king. There is a difference. We chained you for the safety of this entire pack, on your own insistence, if I recall correctly. A servant girl wandering freely into a chamber, meant to contain a dangerous force, undermines the very safety that confinement was meant to provide. She has never once been harmed, Kellen said. Not by the chains, and not by me. So far, Thorne said pointedly, but 7 years of careful containment should not be risked on the strength of so far, my king. I would think you, of all people, would understand the danger of assuming safety where none has been proven. The words landed exactly where Thorne intended, striking at the deepest fear Kellen carried, the fear that had kept him chained in the first place. For a long moment, he said nothing, the weight of 7 years of guilt pressing heavily against his chest. What do you propose? Kellen finally asked, his voice quieter than before. I propose the girl be reassigned, Thorne said smoothly. Perhaps to one of the outer settlements, where her healing skills can be put to good use, far from this chamber, and far from any further risk to herself or to this pack's stability. No, Kellen said, the word escaping him before he had fully decided to speak it, sharper and more certain than he intended. Thorne raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the force of the refusal. My king, I understand you may have grown accustomed to her presence, but surely you can see the wisdom in. I said no, Kellen repeated, meeting Thorne's gaze directly, gold flickering faintly in his eyes despite his effort to remain calm. She stays at Blackthorn. That is my decision, and it is final. A tense silence stretched between them, before Thorne inclined his head slightly, a gesture of deference that did not quite reach his eyes. Of course, my king. It is, as always, your decision to make. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. Though I would ask you to consider, carefully, what it means that after 7 years of perfect containment, this council finds itself questioning your judgment for the first time. I would hate to see old doubts resurface over a matter as small as a servant girl's placement. The threat, though carefully disguised as concern, was unmistakable. Kellen watched him leave, the chamber door closing with a heavy, final sound, and only then did he allow himself to feel the full weight of what had just occurred. Thorne had drawn a line, quiet and careful, but a line nonetheless, and Kellen understood, with growing unease, exactly what crossing it might eventually cost. When Alara returned 2 nights later, having heard only fragments of what had happened from an anxious Garrick, she found Kellen more withdrawn than she had seen him in weeks, his earlier warmth replaced by a heavy, guarded silence. What happened? She asked, settling into her usual place across from him. Thorne wanted you sent away, Kellen said quietly. I refused. Alara's breath caught. You should not have risked yourself for my sake. I did not do it only for your sake, Kellen said, meeting her eyes. I did it because for the first time in 7 years, someone looked at me and did not see only a monster to be feared, or a burden to be managed. I am not willing to lose that, regardless of what it costs me, with the council. Alara was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the weight of his words. Tell me more about that night, she said finally. The one that changed everything. I want to understand, truly, what happened, not the rumors, not the whispers, the truth, as you remember it. Kellen hesitated, old grief resurfacing behind his eyes, but something in her steady, patient gaze convinced him to continue where he had left off weeks before. It was a gathering of the full council, he said slowly, celebrating an alliance we had recently secured with a neighboring pack. There was wine, laughter, the kind of evening that should have been simple and unremarkable. I remember feeling strange, partway through, a heaviness settling over my thoughts that I could not explain. I remember trying to excuse myself, believing I was simply tired. And then there is a gap, an emptiness where memory should be, until I woke on the floor of the council chamber, surrounded by wreckage and blood, with no understanding of what had happened in between. "Who discovered you?" Ilara asked gently. "Garrick," Kellen said. "He was young then, newly promoted to the guard, and he told me later that he found me kneeling amid the destruction, my hands shaking, my eyes still partly shifted, unable to speak. 2 guards had been badly injured trying to subdue whatever had taken hold of me. The healers said afterward that they found traces of a rare poison in the remaining wine, something specifically designed to weaken a wolf's control over the shift. Someone in that room, someone I had trusted enough to share a meal and a toast with, had wanted me broken." "Do you know who?" Ilara asked. "No," Kellen admitted, frustration bleeding into his voice. The investigation that followed was quiet, careful, and ultimately fruitless. Whoever poisoned that wine was skilled enough to leave no trace beyond the poison itself. I chained myself the next morning, before the investigation had even concluded, because I could not bear the thought of waiting to learn whether it might happen again, while more innocent lives hung in the balance. Ilara reached out slowly, and took his hand, the chain rattling softly at the movement, though as always, it caused her no harm. "Someone wanted you weak," she said quietly. "Someone wanted this exact outcome. A king locked away, a council free to rule in his place. Have you considered that the same person who poisoned you 7 years ago may be the very same person keeping you chained now?" Kellen's eyes snapped up to hers, something sharp and dangerous flickering behind the gold. "You believe Thorn was responsible?" "I believe," Ilara said carefully, "that a man who benefits so completely from your confinement, who reacts so strongly to the possibility of your control returning, deserves closer examination than he has apparently ever received." The chamber fell silent as the weight of the suggestion settled over them both. 7 years of guilt, 7 years of self-imposed punishment, all built upon the assumption that the danger had come entirely from within himself. The possibility that it had come instead from someone else's ambition, someone who still walked freely through the halls above, cast everything Kellen believed about his own confinement into sudden, unsettling doubt. "If that is true," Kellen said slowly, "then everything I have believed about myself for 7 years may be built on a lie." "Perhaps," Ilara said softly, "it is time to find out for certain." Outside the chamber, unnoticed by either of them, Finn stood watch in the corridor, his young face troubled by fragments of conversation he had overheard through the heavy door. He had served under Garrick for only a short time, but even in that brief span, he had come to trust his captain's judgment completely, and Garrick had made his own suspicions about Lord Thorn known in quiet, careful words, shared only with those he trusted most. Finn resolved, standing alone in the flickering torchlight, that whatever came next in this unfolding mystery, he would do everything within his power to help uncover the truth, for the sake of the king who had ruled with such warmth before the chains, and for the sake of the quiet healer who had somehow found a way to reach him when no one else could. The following morning, Ilara sought out Bettina in the healing hall, choosing her questions with the same careful precision she had used in the council chamber weeks earlier. "You mentioned once that you tended the king before his confinement," she said, grinding herbs with deliberate casualness. "Do you remember anything about the night everything changed? Who was present? What was said? Anything unusual in the days before?" Bettina's hands stilled over her work, her expression turning thoughtful and distant, as though reaching back through years of memory. "It is strange that you ask," she said slowly. "I was not present that night, but I treated one of the injured guards afterward, a man named Osric. May his memory rest easy. He never fully recovered from his wounds, and passed some years later. Before he died, he told me something that always struck me as odd, though I never knew what to make of it." "What did he tell you?" Ilara asked, keeping her voice carefully even. "He said that in the chaos of that night, before the king lost control entirely, he saw someone slip out of the council chamber unusually early, before the wine had even been fully served to the rest of the table. He assumed at the time it meant nothing, simply someone stepping out for air, but looking back, after everything that followed, he always wondered whether that person had known something the rest of them did not." "Did he say who it was?" Ilara pressed, her heart beginning to race. Bettina shook her head slowly. He was never certain enough to name anyone directly, and by the time he might have spoken more plainly, illness had already begun to take his memory. Whatever he suspected, he carried it to his grave without ever putting a name to it. I only remember his unease, the way he would grow quiet whenever the topic arose, as though there was something he wished he had pursued further while he still could. Ilara thanked Bettina and returned to her duties, though her mind turned over the fragment of information again and again throughout the day. Someone had left the council chamber early that night, before the poisoned wine had taken its full effect. It was not proof of anything, not truly, but it was one more thread pulling at the careful story Thorn had maintained for 7 years, one more reason to believe that the truth of that terrible night had never been fully uncovered. That evening, Garrick found a quiet moment to speak privately with Finn as they made their rounds through the quieter corridors of the castle, ensuring no one lingered close enough to overhear. "You have been unusually thoughtful these past few days," Garrick observed. Finn hesitated before answering, choosing his words carefully. "I have served the council for only a short time, but even in that time, I have noticed how carefully Lord Thorn guards information about the king's confinement. It always struck me as strange that a man so concerned with the kingdom's stability shows so little interest in ever seeing that stability restored through the king's return to full health." Garrick's expression grew grave. "You are not wrong to notice that," he said quietly. "I have served Blackthorn far longer than you, Finn, long enough to remember the king before the chains, and long enough to watch how comfortably Thorn has settled into ruling in his place these past 7 years. Comfort, in a man hungry for power, has a way of becoming reluctance to relinquish it, even when relinquishing it would be the right thing to do." "Do you believe he was involved in what happened that night?" Finn asked. "I do not know," Garrick admitted honestly. "But I have learned, in my years of service, that suspicion without proof accomplishes little beyond making enemies of powerful men. If Thorn is indeed responsible for what happened, we will need far more than whispers and old memories to prove it, and far more courage than either of us has yet been asked to show." Finn nodded slowly, the weight of the conversation settling over him as they continued their rounds in silence, both men now carrying the same quiet determination to uncover whatever truth still lay buried beneath 7 years of careful secrecy, whatever the cost of finding it might eventually prove to be. When Ilara returned to the chamber 2 nights later, she carried with her the fragment of memory Bettina had shared, watching carefully for Kellen's reaction as she relayed the old guard's account of someone slipping away early from that fateful gathering. "Osric," Kellen repeated softly, closing his eyes as though trying to summon the man's face from memory. "I remember him, a steady man, loyal to a fault. I did not know he carried that memory all these years, without ever speaking it aloud." "Bettina said he was never certain enough to name anyone," Ilara said, "but it confirms what we already suspected. Someone in that room knew what was about to happen before the rest of you did." Kellen's jaw tightened, old anger surfacing beneath years of carefully controlled grief. 7 years, he said quietly. 7 years, I have punished myself for something that may have been engineered from the very beginning, by someone who has spent every one of those years growing more comfortable ruling in my place. "We do not have proof yet," Ilara cautioned gently, though she could see the fire building behind his eyes, a fire that had nothing to do with the wolf, and everything to do with a man finally allowing himself to question the guilt he had carried for far too long. "Thorn is careful, and powerful. If we move too quickly, without certainty, we risk losing everything, including whatever trust still exists between you and this council. Then we will move carefully," Kellen said, his voice steadier now, carrying a note of purpose she had not heard from him before. "But we will move. I have spent 7 years accepting a version of events that may never have been entirely true. I owe it to myself, and to every person harmed that night, to finally learn the truth of what truly happened." Ilara reached out and took his hand once more, the chain rattling softly between them as it always did, harmless beneath her touch. "Then we will find it together," she said quietly. "Whatever it costs, whatever it takes." Kellen looked down at their joined hands, silver chain and warm skin resting together in a way that should have been impossible, and felt something stir within him that he had not allowed himself to feel in 7 long years. Not merely hope, though hope was part of it, but purpose, sharp and clear, cutting through years of self-imposed darkness, like the first true light he had seen in far too long. Winter settled over Blackthorn in the weeks that followed, blanketing the courtyard in frost, and driving most of the castle indoors earlier each evening, which suited Alara's secret visits well. The longer nights gave her more time in the chamber below, more time to piece together fragments of the past with Kellen, more time to feel the strange, undeniable pull between them grow steadily stronger with each stolen hour. It was on one such frozen evening, with wind howling faintly through the high windows above, that everything between them shifted in a way neither had fully prepared for. Alara arrived later than usual, delayed by an emergency in the healing hall where a young pup had come down with a dangerous fever. By the time she finally made her way down to the west wing, exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders, and she barely noticed the faint golden shimmer that had begun to gather in the chamber even before she reached the door. Kellen felt her approach before she arrived, an awareness that had been growing steadily over the past weeks, a sense of her presence that reached him even through solid stone. It unsettled him at first, this strange new sensitivity, but he had come to recognize it now, the same way he recognized his own heartbeat. "You are tired," he said the moment she stepped through the door, concern immediately replacing the warmth that usually greeted her. "A fever, in one of the youngest pups," Alara said, settling heavily onto the floor across from him. "Bettina and I worked through most of the evening before it finally broke. He will recover, I believe, but it took everything we had to be certain of it." "You should rest," Kellen said. "You do not need to spend your remaining strength down here with me." "I wanted to see you," Alara said simply, too tired to guard her words as carefully as she usually did. Even exhausted, especially exhausted perhaps. Kellen studied her in the flickering torchlight, something warm and fierce rising in his chest at her admission. "Come here," he said quietly, extending his hand as far as the chain would allow. Alara hesitated only a moment before shifting closer, close enough that when she reached out and took his hand, their fingers laced together fully for the first time, rather than the brief, careful touches they had shared while treating his wounds. The moment their fingers intertwined, something shifted in the chamber, a warmth that had nothing to do with the torch burning nearby, a golden light that seemed to pulse faintly from where their hands met. Alara gasped softly, staring down at the strange glow surrounding their joined hands. "What is happening?" Kellen's breath caught as recognition dawned across his face. Old legends he had dismissed years ago, suddenly rushing back with undeniable clarity. "The bond," he said quietly, wonder and fear mingling equally in his voice. The old stories were true. This is what a true mate bond feels like when it finally wakes. "A mate bond," Alara repeated, her heart pounding as pieces began falling into place. The chains that never burned her, the pull she had felt from that very first night, the warmth that had settled over her every time she was near him, despite everything logic told her she should fear. "That is why the silver never harmed me. A true bond transcends the ordinary rules of our kind," Kellen said slowly, still staring at their joined hands with an expression somewhere between disbelief and reverent awe. "Silver cannot harm what belongs, at the deepest level, to the wolf that wears it. You were never in danger from these chains, Alara, because on some level, deeper than either of us understood, you were never truly separate from me at all." The weight of the revelation settled heavily over both of them, silence stretching between them, as they absorbed the enormity of what it meant. Alara had heard stories of mate bonds growing up, whispered legends passed between pack elders about souls recognizing each other across any distance, any danger, any obstacle placed between them. She had never truly believed such connections existed outside of comforting tales, meant to give hope to the lonely. "This changes everything," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "It does," Kellen agreed, though something in his expression had grown troubled despite the warmth still radiating between their joined hands. "And it terrifies me." "Why?" Alara asked, searching his face for understanding. "Because a bond this strong ties your fate to mine," Kellen said quietly. "If Thorn is indeed responsible for what happened 7 years ago, if he sees you as a threat to the power he has built in my absence, a confirmed mate bond will only make you more of a target, not less. And because," he continued, his voice growing rougher, "I still do not fully trust myself, even now. I cannot bear the thought of the wolf ever turning on the one person fate itself has chosen to stand beside me." Alara tightened her grip on his hand, refusing to let the fear in his voice diminish the warmth, still glowing softly between them. The bond exists because something in you recognized something in me, long before either of us understood what it meant, she said firmly. That is not a curse, Kellen. It is proof, clearer than any argument I could make, that whatever happened 7 years ago was never truly who you are. Kellen closed his eyes, leaning his forehead gently against their joined hands, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, simply allowing the quiet warmth of the bond to settle over them both, a small, fragile comfort against the uncertainty that surrounded them on every side. Word of their bond, however, was not so easily contained. Bonds of this nature carried a resonance felt not only by the two people involved, but by those closely attuned to pack magic, and within the castle, few were more attuned than Odette, whose family had served as pack seers for generations before she joined Thorn's council. She felt the shift the very night it occurred, a ripple of ancient magic passing through the castle's old stones, unmistakable to anyone trained to sense such things. She said nothing to Thorn immediately, choosing instead to sit with the knowledge overnight, turning over its implications with far more care than her position on the council typically allowed her. The following morning, she found Thorn in his study, reviewing reports from the northern border, where raider activity had increased steadily over recent weeks. There is something you should know, Odette said carefully, closing the study door behind her. Thorn looked up, sensing immediately the gravity in her tone. Speak plainly, Odette. We have little patience for riddles this morning. I felt a bond form last night, Odette said. A true mate bond, old magic, the kind our ancestors spoke of but few among us have witnessed directly. I believe it involves the king. Thorn's expression grew very still. The healer. I cannot be certain without further investigation, Odette said, but the timing, the strength of the resonance, it fits nothing else I can imagine. If it is true, if a genuine mate bond exists between the king and this girl, it changes everything about how this council must proceed. Explain, Thorn said, though his tone suggested he already understood the implications far better than he wished to admit. A confirmed mate bond carries weight among the pack, that even 7 years of confinement cannot easily override, Odette said. If word spreads that the king has found his true mate, that she alone can touch him without harm, the people will see it as a sign, exactly as the old stories promise, proof that he can be trusted, that his control has returned, that the chains may finally be unnecessary. Support for his full return to power could grow faster than this council may be prepared to manage. Thorn's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign of the calculations racing behind his composed expression. 7 years of careful influence, 7 years of quietly consolidating authority, while a broken king remained locked away, all of it now threatened by a mate bond neither he nor anyone else had anticipated. This cannot be allowed to spread beyond these walls, Thorn said finally, his voice low and controlled. Not yet. Not until we understand fully what it means, and what, if anything, can be done to manage the consequences. You wish to suppress the news of a true mate bond, Odette said carefully, unable to fully hide her unease at the suggestion. That is no small matter, Alistair. Bonds of this nature are considered sacred among our kind. Interfering with one carries consequences, both practical and, some would say, spiritual. I am not suggesting we interfere with the bond itself, Thorn said smoothly, though something cold flickered behind his eyes. Only that this council controls when and how such news reaches the wider pack, for the sake of stability, nothing more. Odette said nothing further, though privately, she found herself wondering, not for the first time, whether Thorn's careful concern for stability had long ago become simple, unchecked ambition, dressed carefully in the language of duty. That evening, unaware of the conversation unfolding above them, Ilara and Kellen sat together in the quiet chamber, the golden warmth of their bond still humming faintly beneath the surface of every touch, every glance shared between them. For the first time in 7 years, Kellen allowed himself to imagine a future beyond these stone walls, a life where the chains might finally fall away, where he might walk freely among his people once more, this time with Ilara beside him, rather than a shadow of guilt trailing behind him. But even as hope took root, cautious and fragile, in the chamber below, the careful machinery of Thorn's ambition had already begun turning against them, quiet and patient, waiting for the right moment to strike at the one thing capable of undoing 7 years of carefully built control. In the days that followed, Elara found herself carrying the secret of the bond like a warm stone tucked close to her heart, both comforting and heavy in equal measure. She longed to share it with someone, if only to make the strange, wonderful reality of it feel more solid, more real. But she understood instinctively the danger such knowledge carried if it reached the wrong ears. Still, she could not entirely hide the change in herself. Talia noticed it first, catching the faint, distracted smile that kept tugging at Elara's lips even during the most mundane tasks. The way her friend's gaze seemed to drift toward the west wing, more often than mere curiosity could explain. "You are glowing," Talia observed one afternoon, as they folded linens together in companionable quiet. "Whatever is happening between you and that chamber below, it agrees with you." "I do not know what you mean," Elara said, though the warmth rising in her cheeks betrayed her poorly. Talia laughed softly, setting aside a folded sheet. "Elara Voss, I have known you only a few short months, but even I can see when someone has fallen for a person they should not have fallen for. I will not press you for details you are not ready to share. Only know that whatever it is, I am glad to see you smiling again. You carried so much sorrow when you first arrived here." Elara reached out and squeezed her friend's hand gratefully, unable to fully explain the depth of what had grown between herself and Kellen, unwilling to risk the danger that full honesty might invite. "Thank you for not asking too many questions," she said simply. "That is what friends are for," Talia replied, returning to her folding with a knowing smile that suggested she understood far more than she let on, and would keep that understanding carefully to herself. That night, when Elara returned to the chamber, she found Kellen deep in thought, staring at the chain around his wrist, with an intensity that suggested his mind had wandered somewhere far from the present moment. "You seem troubled," she observed, settling into her usual place. "I have been trying to remember," Kellen said slowly. "More of that night. Since the bond formed, since my mind has felt clearer than it has in years, fragments keep surfacing that I had thought lost forever." "What do you remember?" Elara asked, leaning forward with careful attention. "Voices," Kellen said, his brow furrowing with the effort of recall. "Before the darkness took hold completely, I remember voices arguing, quiet enough that I could not make out the words, but tense, urgent. And I remember a scent, faint beneath the wine, something bitter and unfamiliar, that I dismissed at the time as simply an unfamiliar vintage. I understand now, looking back, that it was likely the poison itself." "Can you recall whose voices they were?" Elara pressed gently. Kellen closed his eyes, concentrating hard, frustration creasing his features as the memory remained frustratingly incomplete. "Not clearly," he admitted. "But one voice, I believe, belonged to Thorn. I cannot be certain. 7 years have dulled even these fragments considerably. But something about the tone, the cadence, feels familiar in a way that unsettles me deeply." "That is not proof," Elara said carefully, though her pulse quickened at the confirmation, however uncertain, of what they had both begun to suspect. "But it is another thread pulling in the same direction as everything else we have learned." "I know," Kellen said, opening his eyes to meet hers, "and I do not know what troubles me more, the possibility that Thorn orchestrated everything that has happened these past 7 years, or the possibility that even now, with these fragments returning, I still cannot be certain enough to act." "Then we gather more," Elara said firmly, carefully, patiently, until certainty is no longer in question. "You have waited 7 years for the truth, Kellen. We can afford to wait a little longer to be certain we uncover the right one." Kellen reached for her hand, the familiar golden warmth passing gently between them, a small comfort against the uncertainty that continued to press in from every side. "I do not know what I would do without you in this," he admitted quietly. 7 years. I convinced myself that solitude was the only safe path forward. You have shown me, in only a few short months, exactly how wrong I was. "We will find the truth together," Elara said, echoing the promise she had made weeks before. A promise that felt heavier now, more urgent, with each new fragment of memory and suspicion that came to light. "And when we do, this council will no longer be able to hide behind 7 years of careful silence." Outside, unheard by either of them, A soft sound echoed briefly in the corridor beyond the chamber door, the faint scrape of a boot against stone, quickly withdrawn into the shadows before either Garrick or Finn, distracted by their own quiet conversation nearby, could notice the presence that had lingered just long enough to hear more than either Alara or Kellen would have wished any stranger to overhear. Corwin moved swiftly and silently back through the servants' passage, his mind racing over what he had just heard, weighing carefully how best to present it to Lord Thorn, in a way that would secure his own position within the council's favor. He had been sent that night on a routine errand, delivering sealed correspondence to Garrick regarding the following week's watch schedule, and had lingered longer than necessary out of simple curiosity, when he noticed the chamber door slightly ajar, and voices drifting from within that should not have belonged there at that hour. What he had heard troubled him deeply, not merely the confirmation of a forbidden bond between the king and the healer, but the fragments of memory Kellen had described, fragments that pointed, however uncertainly, toward Lord Thorn's own voice present in that fateful council chamber 7 years ago. Corwin had served Thorn loyally for many years, risen through the ranks of the council's household on the strength of that loyalty, and the implications of what he had overheard sat uneasily, alongside everything he believed he understood about the man he served. He found Thorn still awake in his study well past midnight, reviewing correspondence by candlelight, and delivered his report in careful, measured words, watching closely for any reaction that might confirm or deny the suspicions now forming in his own mind. Thorn listened in silence, his expression giving away nothing, until Corwin finished speaking, at which point he set down the letter he had been reading, with deliberate calm. "A confirmed bond," Thorn said slowly, and fragments of memory returning to the king regarding that night 7 years ago. "This is precisely the situation I hoped to avoid. My lord," Corwin said carefully. The king mentioned a voice he believed he recognized, present in the chamber, before the poisoning took hold. He was not certain, but he named you specifically as a possibility. A long silence stretched through the study, heavy enough that Corwin found himself holding his breath, uncertain whether he had just secured his position within the council, or placed himself in far greater danger than he had anticipated, by delivering such news so plainly. "Uncertain memories, 7 years old, offered by a man who has spent that entire span isolated and unstable," Thorn said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "That is hardly proof of anything, Corwin, but it does confirm that time is working against this council's stability faster than I had hoped. The bond alone would have been manageable, given careful handling. Combined with returning memories, however incomplete, it becomes considerably more dangerous." "What would you have me do, my lord?" Corwin asked. Thorn considered the question for a long moment, his fingers drumming slowly against the polished surface of his desk. "Nothing, for now," he said finally. "Continue your duties exactly as before. Say nothing of what you overheard to anyone else within this castle, not even Odette. I will consider carefully how best to proceed, and when I require your assistance further, I will make that clear to you directly." Corwin bowed and took his leave, though the uneasy feeling that had settled over him during his report did not fully dissipate as he made his way back through the darkened corridors toward his own quarters. He had served Thorn loyally for years, believing wholeheartedly in the stability his lord had provided during the king's long confinement. But something in Thorn's careful, calculated response to the news he had delivered left Corwin with a lingering unease he could not quite shake, a growing suspicion that the truth of what had happened 7 years ago might be considerably more complicated and considerably darker than he had ever allowed himself to consider. Alone in his study once the door had closed behind Corwin, Thorn remained still for a long while, staring into the flickering candlelight, with an expression that revealed, for the first time in 7 carefully controlled years, the true depth of what he stood to lose, should the full truth of that fateful night ever come fully to light. Whatever plans had been set in motion 7 years ago, whatever ambitions had driven them, Thorn understood now, with growing clarity, that the careful balance he had maintained for so long had begun, at last, to tip dangerously toward collapse. 3 days after Corwin's late-night report, Alara noticed the first small changes in how the castle treated her, subtle enough at first that she almost convinced herself she was imagining things. A guard who had always greeted her warmly in the mornings now simply nodded, his eyes sliding away too quickly. Bettina, usually generous with her time and guidance, seemed distracted whenever Alara entered the healing hall, offering shorter answers to questions than she once had. Even Dessa, who had watched over Alara like a protective aunt since her very first night at Blackthorn, grew visibly tense whenever the topic of the West Wing arose in conversation. "Something has shifted," Alara said quietly to Talia one evening, the two of them sharing a simple meal in the corner of the servants' hall. "I can feel it, even if I cannot explain exactly what it is." Talia glanced around carefully before leaning in close. "There are whispers," she admitted reluctantly. "I did not want to worry you, but you should know. Some are saying the council suspects you of using some kind of dark magic to bind the king to you unnaturally. Others say Lord Thorn himself has begun questioning whether your presence here threatens the pack's safety." Alara's stomach tightened uncomfortably. "That is not true. Whatever exists between the king and myself was never something I sought or created." "I believe you," Talia said quickly. "But belief does not always matter, not when powerful men decide a story serves their purposes better than the truth. Be careful, Alara. Whatever is happening, I fear it is only the beginning." That fear proved well-founded. 2 days later, Alara was summoned once more to the council chamber, this time without the courtesy of advance warning, pulled directly from her work in the healing hall by a guard whose grim expression offered little comfort. The chamber felt colder than she remembered from her first visit, though whether that was truly the temperature of the room or simply the atmosphere created by the full council seated grimly around the long table, Alara could not be certain. Thorn sat at the head as before, though his careful, measured demeanor from their first meeting had hardened into something far more severe. "Alara Voss," Thorn began without preamble, "you stand accused of forming an unauthorized and potentially dangerous bond with the king of this pack, using means this council does not yet fully understand, in direct violation of explicit orders forbidding your continued presence in the West Wing." "I have formed no bond through unnatural means," Alara said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage despite the fear tightening in her chest. "What exists between myself and the king is a true mate bond, recognized by our kind for generations. I did not create it. I could not have created it, even if I wished to." "A convenient claim," said one of the counselors Alara did not recognize, an older man with a sharp, suspicious gaze. "Mate bonds of the kind you describe are exceedingly rare, spoken of more often in legend than witnessed in truth. Forgive this council for requiring more than your word alone, before accepting such an extraordinary explanation." "Ask Odette," Alara said, meeting the woman's eyes directly across the table. "I have heard she carries the gift of sensing such things. If a true bond exists, surely she has already confirmed it." A flicker of surprise crossed several faces around the table, and Alara noticed Odette shift uncomfortably in her seat, clearly caught between her own confirmed sensing of the bond and whatever careful strategy Thorn had instructed the council to pursue. "Odette's perceptions," Thorn said smoothly, cutting off whatever response the seer might have offered, "are a separate matter from this council's primary concern, which is the continued safety and stability of this pack. Bond or no bond, the king has spent 7 years in careful, controlled confinement, precisely because his capacity for violence remains unpredictable. Your continued presence in his chamber, regardless of any claimed connection between you, represents a risk this council can no longer responsibly overlook." "He has never once harmed me," Alara said firmly. "Not in all the months I have visited him. If anything, my presence has helped him heal wounds this council allowed to fester for 7 years without proper treatment." "And if that changes," Thorn pressed, "if the bond you claim exists somehow triggers an unforeseen response, who among us will bear responsibility for the consequences? This council, or a servant girl who defied direct orders repeatedly, for reasons of her own?" Alara had no immediate answer to that, the fear underlying Thorn's question landing more effectively than she wished to admit. She thought of Kellen's own doubts, his fear that even now, even with the bond, his control could not be fully trusted. Thorn was using that same uncertainty as a weapon, and she did not know how to counter an argument built upon a fear she herself had not fully resolved. "This council," Thorn continued, sensing her hesitation, "has decided that further visits to the West Wing will not be permitted, effective immediately. You will remain confined to your duties within the kitchens and healing hall, and any attempt to circumvent this order will result in immediate dismissal from Blackthorn, and potential expulsion from the pack's protection entirely." The threat landed with the full weight Thorn intended, and Alara felt the blood drain from her face at the thought of losing not only her connection to Kellen, but the only safe haven she had found since Ashwell burned. "You cannot simply erase a true bond by forbidding visits," she said quietly, though the fight had gone out of her voice. "Perhaps not," Thorne said, rising from his seat, signaling the end of the discussion. "But this council can control the circumstances surrounding it, and for now, that will have to suffice. You are dismissed." Alara left the chamber in a daze, Garrick's grim expression at the door confirming that he had already heard of the council's decision before she emerged. He said nothing, as he escorted her back toward the kitchens, though the tension in his shoulders spoke clearly enough of his own frustration, with a decision he had no power to overturn. That night, alone in her small room, Alara allowed herself to cry for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn. The accumulated grief of Ashwell, the fear of the council's threats, and the ache of being forcibly separated from Kellen, all finally breaking through the careful composure she had maintained for so long. She curled beneath her thin blanket, the bond pulling insistently at her chest, an ache that felt almost physical in its intensity, a constant reminder of everything she had been forbidden from reaching. Deep below, in the chamber he had called home for 7 long years, Kellen felt her distress as clearly as if she stood beside him, the bond carrying her grief across the stone walls that separated them. He strained against his chains that night for the first time in years, not from any loss of control, but from the simple, desperate need to reach someone he could not protect from behind locked doors. Garrick found him in that state when he arrived with the evening meal, and the sight of the king straining silently against silver that had never before caused him to fight so openly, struck the old captain with an urgency he could not ignore. "My king," Garrick said carefully, setting down the tray. "What has happened?" "They have forbidden her from returning," Kellen said, his voice rough with barely restrained emotion. "I can feel her pain through the bond, Garrick, and I can do nothing to ease it from within these walls." Garrick was quiet for a long moment, weighing loyalty to the council against loyalty to the king he had served since before the chains, before finally speaking words he had held back for years. "My king, if I may speak plainly, I have served this council faithfully since your confinement began, believing it acted in the Pack's best interest. But I have watched Lord Thorne grow more comfortable in his authority with each passing year, and I have watched him grow considerably less comfortable these past weeks, ever since Alara first walked through that door. A man confident in the righteousness of his position does not typically fear a servant girl's presence so deeply." Kellen's eyes lifted sharply to meet Garrick's. "You believe as I do, then, that Thorne fears the truth coming to light more than he fears any danger I might pose?" "I believe," Garrick said carefully, "that 7 years is a very long time for a man to grow accustomed to power he was never meant to hold permanently. And I believe, my king, that whatever happens next, you will need allies within these walls who remember what you were before the chains, and who are willing to help you become that man again. Will you be one of those allies?" Kellen asked quietly. Garrick knelt beside him, his expression solemn in the flickering torchlight. "I have been one since the night I found you in that ruined council chamber, my king. Though I confess, I did not always know how best to serve that loyalty. I know now. Whatever truth lies buried in these 7 years of silence, I will help you uncover it, whatever the cost to myself." Kellen reached out and gripped the older man's shoulder firmly, gratitude and renewed purpose steadying him in a way nothing had since the council's decision had first reached him. "Then we begin tonight," he said, determination hardening his voice into something that had not been heard within those chamber walls in 7 long years. "I will not spend one more day believing a lie built to keep me weak, and I will not allow Thorne to keep Alara from me through fear alone." Outside the chamber, the wind howled against the high windows of Blackthorn Castle, carrying with it the quiet promise of change that had been building steadily for weeks, ready now, at last, to break fully into the open. In her own quarters 2 floors above, Odette sat awake long after the council meeting had ended, turning over the events of the day with growing unease. She had felt the truth of the bond the moment it formed, had known with absolute certainty that the connection between Alara and Kellen was exactly what the old stories described, rare and sacred, and utterly beyond anyone's ability to manufacture or fake. Yet she had sat silently through Thorne's careful dismissal of that truth, had watched him twist genuine danger into a convenient excuse to separate the two, and had said nothing to defend what she knew, in her heart, to be real. The weight of that silence pressed heavily on her conscience as the night wore on. Her family had served as pack seers for generations, entrusted with recognizing and honoring the old magic that bound their kind together in ways deeper than politics or ambition could ever reach. She had joined Thorn's council believing she could serve that sacred duty even within the practical demands of governance. Increasingly, she feared she had instead become complicit in burying a truth that deserved, by every tradition she had been raised to honor, to be brought fully into the light. She rose before dawn the next morning, dressing quickly, and made her way not toward the council chambers where her duties typically began, but toward the healing hall, where she knew Ilara would soon arrive for her morning shift. Ilara looked exhausted when she appeared, dark shadows beneath her eyes betraying a sleepless night, though she straightened immediately upon noticing Odette waiting near the entrance. "I did not expect to see you here," Ilara said carefully, uncertain whether to expect further trouble from the council seer. "I owe you an apology," Odette said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were not overheard. "I confirmed the bond exists. I knew it the very night it formed. I said nothing yesterday when Thorn dismissed its significance before the full council, and that silence sits poorly with me now." Ilara studied her carefully, searching for any hidden motive behind the unexpected admission. "Why tell me this now?" "Because what is happening here is wrong," Odette said, her voice low but firm. "A true bond is sacred among our kind, Ilara. It is not something to be hidden away or dismissed for the sake of political convenience. I do not yet know what role Lord Thorn played in the tragedy 7 years ago, but I know that his handling of your bond with the king has been driven by fear of losing his own authority, not by genuine concern for this pack's safety." "Will you say so, before the council?" Ilara asked. Odette hesitated, old caution warring visibly with newfound conviction. "Not yet," she admitted. "I do not yet have proof strong enough to challenge Thorn directly, and doing so without proof would only see me removed from any position where I might still help you. But I can help quietly, in ways that draw less attention. I have access to old council records, correspondence, and ledgers dating back to that night 7 years ago. If there is evidence of what truly happened, buried somewhere within those archives, I may be able to find it." Relief and gratitude flooded through Ilara at the unexpected offer of alliance. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "I did not expect to find any support within the council itself." "Not all of us have forgotten what loyalty to this pack is meant to mean," Odette said, a faint, weary smile touching her lips for the first time. "Be patient, Ilara, and be careful. Thorn is not a man who tolerates challenges to his authority easily, and if he learns of my assistance before we have gathered enough proof to act, both of us will find ourselves in far greater danger than either currently faces." Ilara nodded, watching Odette slip quietly back toward the council wing before the rest of the castle fully woke, carrying with her a fragile new hope that had not existed the night before. The bond ached steadily in her chest, a constant reminder of the distance now enforced between herself and Kellen. But for the first time since the council's harsh decree, she felt something other than helplessness settling over her. Allies were gathering, quiet and careful, on both sides of the divide that separated the chained king from the throne that rightfully belonged to him. Whatever truth remained buried beneath 7 years of silence, Ilara understood now that it would not remain hidden much longer. Nearly 2 weeks passed before Odette found anything of substance among the old council archives. Weeks that stretched long and difficult for both Ilara and Kellen, separated by a barrier of authority neither could yet find a safe way around. Ilara threw herself into her work with a fierce determination that both impressed and worried Bettina, who noticed the hollow look that had settled behind her assistant's eyes, despite the steady competence of her hands. She treated fevers and broken bones and the small everyday injuries of castle life, all while the bond in her chest pulsed with a constant, muted ache that never fully faded, a reminder of the connection she was forbidden from tending directly. Kellen, for his part, spent those same weeks in careful, deliberate practice, working with Garrick under cover of darkness, to test the limits of the control he had spent 7 years doubting. Garrick brought small tokens into the chamber, objects of no particular danger, and observed closely, as Kellen focused his will against the pull of the wolf beneath his skin, proving to himself, slowly and methodically, that the man remained firmly in command. "Your control has not wavered once," Garrick observed one evening, watching Kellen hold perfectly steady, despite the deliberate provocations Garrick had been instructed to attempt, raised voices, sudden movements, even the careful scent of blood from a minor cut Garrick had allowed on his own hand for the purpose of the test. 7 years, and not once have you lost yourself to the wolf outside of that single poisoned night. Perhaps the bond has strengthened my control, Kellen said thoughtfully. Or perhaps, as Alara suggested from the very beginning, the wolf was never truly the danger this council claimed it to be. Either way, Garrick said, the evidence grows harder to ignore with each passing day. You are not the danger you have spent 7 years believing yourself to be. It was Odette, however, who finally uncovered proof substantial enough to change everything. Buried within a ledger of council expenditures from the months preceding the poisoning, carefully filed away and largely forgotten, she found record of an unusual purchase, a rare and expensive herb, known primarily for its use in weakening a wolf's control over the shift, ordered under a name she did not immediately recognize, delivered to the castle only 3 days before the fateful gathering. She spent another full day tracing the name through older records before finally connecting it to a merchant known to have conducted private business with Lord Thorn on several previous occasions, transactions carefully separated from official council business through intermediaries designed to obscure the true buyer's identity. Trembling slightly with the weight of what she had found, Odette sought out Alara that same evening, finding her alone in the healing hall long after the other staff had retired for the night. I have something, Odette said without preamble, closing the door carefully behind her and producing a small bundle of documents from beneath her cloak. Proof, or close enough to it, that the herb used to weaken the king's control 7 years ago was purchased through channels connected directly to Lord Thorn. Alara's hands shook as she examined the documents Odette spread carefully across the healing hall's worn wooden table. The careful record of purchase, the intermediary's name, the delivery date matching precisely with the timeline Kellen had described. This is real, she breathed. This is truly real. It is strong evidence, Odette cautioned, though not yet absolute proof. Thorn is careful, and clever. He will have prepared explanations for any inconsistency this might raise, should we bring it before the full council too soon. We must proceed carefully, gathering whatever additional confirmation we can, before confronting him directly. Kellen needs to see this, Alara said. He deserves to know, regardless of how carefully we must proceed afterward. Odette nodded slowly. I agree, but we cannot risk another discovery like the one Corwin nearly witnessed weeks ago. If Thorn learns we possess this evidence before we are ready to act, he may move against us far more swiftly than we can prepare to counter. They agreed, after careful discussion, that Odette herself would deliver the documents to Kellen directly, using her position on the council to justify a visit to the chamber that Alara herself could no longer make without immediate consequence. Garrick arranged the meeting for the following evening, ensuring the watch schedule provided sufficient cover for Odette's presence to go unquestioned by anyone loyal to Thorn. Kellen studied the documents by torchlight, with the same careful intensity he had once brought to matters of state 7 years ago, before the chains, before the chamber had become his entire world. The herb's name, the merchant's connection to Thorn, the delivery date, all of it aligned precisely with the fragmented memories that had been slowly returning to him over recent weeks. This confirms it, he said finally, his voice low and controlled, though Odette could see the barely suppressed anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. Thorn poisoned that wine. Thorn orchestrated everything that followed, the chains, my own self-imposed exile, 7 years of guilt I carried, for a crime that was never truly mine to bear. We must proceed carefully, Odette repeated, echoing her earlier caution to Alara. This evidence is strong, but Thorn holds considerable influence over the remaining council members, and unseating him will require more than documents alone. We will need witnesses willing to speak against him, and we will need the full council convinced, beyond reasonable doubt, not merely suspicious. How long will that take? Kellen asked, frustration bleeding into his voice despite his best efforts at control. I do not know, Odette admitted honestly, but rushing forward without sufficient preparation risks losing everything, including whatever chance remains of restoring your rightful place as this pack's true leader. Kellen closed his eyes, drawing on 7 years of hard-won patience, though every instinct within him screamed to act immediately, to confront Thorn directly, and demand the truth he now understood had been stolen from him for far too long. "Very well," he said finally. "We proceed carefully, but not indefinitely, Odette. Alara has already suffered enough separation from this bond. I will not allow that suffering to continue longer than absolutely necessary." Odette nodded, gathering the documents carefully back into her cloak, before slipping quietly from the chamber, leaving Kellen alone once more, with the heavy weight of confirmed betrayal settling over him in the flickering torchlight. Unbeknownst to any of them, however, Corwin's earlier unease regarding Thorne's handling of the situation had continued to grow steadily over the intervening weeks. Troubled by his own doubts, he had begun quietly observing Thorne's movements more closely than his lord realized, and on the very night Odette made her careful visit to the chamber, Corwin happened to notice her slipping away from the council wing toward the west staircase, at an hour when no legitimate council business should have called her there. He followed at a careful distance, uncertain what he hoped to discover, and arrived just in time to see her emerge from the chamber corridor sometime later, documents carefully concealed beneath her cloak, her expression tense with barely suppressed urgency. Corwin's loyalty to Thorne, already strained by weeks of quiet doubt, finally cracked fully beneath the weight of what he had witnessed. He did not report immediately to his lord, as he once would have without hesitation. Instead, he found himself standing in the shadowed corridor long after Odette had disappeared, wrestling with a decision that would determine, in ways he could not yet fully comprehend, the fate of everyone involved in the unfolding conflict. Finally, driven by a conscience he had spent years suppressing in service to ambition he had mistaken for loyalty, Corwin made his way not toward Thorne's study, but toward the small chamber where Garrick kept his private quarters, knocking quietly despite the late hour. Garrick answered with visible surprise, quickly masked behind careful neutrality. "Corwin, what brings you here at this hour?" "I need to speak with you," Corwin said quietly, glancing nervously down the empty corridor behind him. "Somewhere private. I believe I may know something that could help the king, though speaking it aloud may cost me everything I have built these past 7 years." Garrick studied him for a long moment, weighing the risk of trusting a man he had never fully counted among his allies. Finally he stepped aside, gesturing Corwin into the small room and closing the door firmly behind them both. "Speak plainly," Garrick said, "and know that whatever you tell me tonight, if it proves true and proves useful, will not be forgotten when this matter is finally resolved." Corwin took a steadying breath, years of careful loyalty finally giving way to something he recognized, with growing clarity, as genuine remorse. "I overheard a conversation weeks ago," he began slowly, "between the king and the healer, regarding fragments of memory returning to him about the night of the poisoning. I reported what I heard directly to Lord Thorne, believing at the time I was serving this pack's stability." "And now?" Garrick prompted, when Corwin fell silent, clearly struggling with what came next. "Tonight, I witnessed Odette leaving the West Wing chamber, with documents concealed beneath her cloak," Corwin continued. "I do not know what those documents contain, but I have grown increasingly troubled these past weeks by Lord Thorne's behavior, his careful control over information regarding that night, his fear of the king's returning memories. I believe, Garrick, that I have spent 7 years serving a man who may bear far greater responsibility for what happened than any of us ever suspected." Garrick's expression grew grave, though something like cautious relief also flickered behind his careful composure at the unexpected confirmation of allies gathering where he had least expected to find them. "You have done the right thing, coming to me tonight," he said finally. "But you must understand, Corwin, that from this moment forward, your position within this castle becomes considerably more dangerous. Thorne cannot learn of this conversation, not until we are fully prepared to move against him." "I understand," Corwin said, steadier now that the confession had finally left him. "What would you have me do?" "For now," Garrick said, "continue exactly as before. Report to Thorne as you always have. Share nothing of what you have witnessed tonight, or what you have chosen to share with me. But watch him closely, Corwin. Any further movement, any further evidence of his involvement, however small, could prove vital in the days ahead." Corwin nodded, understanding fully the weight of the role he had just accepted, a quiet spy within Thorne's own household, working now toward an outcome that would see everything the man had built these past 7 years finally brought crashing down. As Corwin slipped back into the darkened corridors of Blackthorn Castle, The careful web of allies working quietly toward the truth continued to grow, drawing steadily closer to a confrontation that none of them could much longer delay. Despite the council's strict prohibition, the ache of separation eventually grew too strong for either Alara or Kellen to bear entirely without relief. Nearly 3 weeks after the council's decree, Garrick arranged a single, carefully guarded meeting between them, choosing a night when Thorn himself had traveled to a neighboring settlement to address reports of increased raider activity along the border, leaving the castle's usual watchfulness momentarily diminished. Alara slipped down the familiar staircase, with her heart pounding harder than it ever had on her earliest visits. Fear and longing tangled together in equal measure. When Garrick opened the chamber door for her, the sight of Kellen waiting inside, his expression breaking into open relief at her arrival, nearly undid the careful composure she had maintained for 3 long weeks of forced separation. "I did not think I would see you again so soon," she said softly, crossing the small distance between them, and kneeling close enough that their joined hands brought the familiar golden warmth flooding back between them, sharper and more intense after weeks of enforced absence. "Garrick risked much to arrange this," Kellen said, his voice rough with emotion he no longer bothered to hide. "I could not let the opportunity pass without seeing you, without knowing for certain that you were well." "I am well enough," Alara said, though the shadows beneath her eyes told a different story. "The ache of the bond has been difficult these past weeks. I did not fully understand how deeply it had settled into me until we were forced apart." "Nor did I," Kellen admitted. "There were nights I feared I might lose the careful control I have worked so hard to prove, simply from the strain of being kept from you. But Garrick tells me Odette has found real evidence against Thorn. That gives me hope this separation will not last much longer." "She has," Alara confirmed, relaying quickly the details of the merchant's ledger, the connection to Thorn, the careful trail of evidence Odette continued building even now. "And Corwin has turned as well, Garrick tells me, troubled by his own conscience into helping us, rather than continuing to serve Thorn's ambitions blindly." Kellen's expression hardened at the confirmation of allies gathering steadily against the man who had stolen 7 years of his life through calculated betrayal. "Then it is only a matter of time before we have what we need to bring this before the full council properly, with proof strong enough that even Thorn's most loyal supporters cannot deny it." "And when that day comes," Alara said quietly, "what then? What happens to you, to us, once the truth is finally known?" Kellen considered the question seriously, the weight of 7 years of confinement pressing against the fragile hope now building steadily within him. "I do not fully know," he admitted honestly. "I have spent so long believing myself dangerous, unworthy of trust, that imagining a life beyond these chains still feels almost impossible, even now, even with everything we have learned. But I know that whatever comes next, I want to face it as the man I was always meant to be, not the broken shadow Thorn's betrayal forced me to become. And I want to face it with you beside me, Alara, if you will have me. Chains or no chains, throne or no throne." Alara's eyes filled with tears at the raw honesty in his words. 7 years of careful guardedness finally giving way to something true and unguarded between them. "I have wanted nothing else since the very first night I heard you through these walls," she said softly. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Their remaining time together passed too quickly, as it always did. The golden warmth of the bond, a fragile comfort against the uncertainty still surrounding them on every side. When Garrick finally signaled that it was time for her to leave, before the watch changed and their secret meeting risked discovery, Alara pressed a gentle kiss to Kellen's forehead, the first such gesture either had allowed themselves in the careful months of their growing bond. "Soon," she whispered, "this will not need to be stolen moments in the dark any longer." "Soon," Kellen agreed, watching her slip reluctantly back into the shadowed corridor, carrying with her a renewed determination that mirrored his own, both of them, now fully committed to seeing the truth of 7 stolen years, finally brought into the light, whatever the cost of that reckoning might ultimately prove to be. 2 days later, Thorn returned from the border settlements, earlier than expected, his mood darkened considerably by reports of raider activity that showed no signs of slowing, despite the pack's increased patrols. He found the castle unusually quiet upon his return, a stillness that immediately raised his careful, practiced suspicion, honed over 7 years of maintaining tight control over every aspect of Blackthorn's governance. It did not take him long to notice the subtle signs of activity that had occurred in his absence. A guard's schedule quietly altered. Odette's uncharacteristic absence from her usual duties for several hours the previous evening. A certain watchfulness in Garrick's expression when their paths crossed briefly in the courtyard. Nothing overt, nothing he could immediately point to as evidence of conspiracy, but enough to confirm his growing certainty that forces within his own carefully constructed order had begun moving against him. That evening, alone in his study, Thorn summoned Corwin for a private report, his sharp eyes studying the younger man's careful, composed expression for any sign of the doubt that had begun growing within him. "Has anything of note occurred during my absence?" Thorn asked, his tone deceptively casual. Corwin, drawing on every ounce of the careful discipline he had spent years cultivating in Thorn's service, kept his expression perfectly neutral. "Nothing of significance, my lord. The usual duties, nothing more." Thorn studied him a moment longer, something cold and calculating flickering behind his eyes, before finally nodding, apparently satisfied, though the unease that had settled over him since his return did not fully dissipate. He understood, with the sharp instinct that had served him well through 7 careful years of consolidated power, that time was working against him now, in ways it had not before, and that whatever quiet conspiracy had begun forming beneath his notice would require decisive action to properly contain, before it grew beyond his ability to control it entirely. After Corwin had gone, Thorn remained alone in his study for a long while, turning over the situation with the same careful calculation he had applied 7 years earlier, when the opportunity to reshape Blackthorn's future had first presented itself. He had told himself then, and continued telling himself now, that his actions served the greater stability of the pack, that a kingdom, guided by his steady hand, fared better than one left to the unpredictable whims of a young king still finding his footing. 7 years of careful governance had only deepened that conviction, transforming what had begun as calculated ambition into something he had come to genuinely believe was his rightful place. He would not surrender that place easily, not to fragmented memories 7 years faded, not to old ledgers that could be explained away given sufficient time, and certainly not to a servant girl whose sudden, inexplicable bond with the king threatened to unravel everything he had so carefully built. Rising from his desk, Thorn moved to the window overlooking the dark courtyard below, his reflection faint and sharp-edged against the glass. If Alara Voss could not be separated from the king through simple prohibition, then perhaps a more permanent solution would prove necessary, one that removed the source of the growing conspiracy entirely, before it gathered enough strength to challenge him openly. He did not yet know precisely what form that solution would take. But as he stood watching the frost gather on the courtyard stones below, Thorn understood, with the same cold clarity that had guided every careful decision of the past 7 years, that the quiet game of patience he had played for so long was drawing rapidly to its final, decisive stage, and that he would not allow himself to lose everything now, not when so much remained still within his grasp to protect. The blow, when it finally came, arrived swiftly and without warning, exactly as Thorn had intended. Ilara was summoned from the healing hall, on a gray, overcast morning, by 2 guards she did not recognize, their expressions carefully blank, in a way that immediately set her nerves on edge. They escorted her not toward the council chamber, as she expected, but toward a small, windowless room near the castle's outer gates, sparsely furnished with only a single table and 2 chairs. Thorn was already waiting when she arrived, seated calmly behind the table, his expression carrying none of the careful diplomacy he had shown during their previous encounters. "Sit," he said simply, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. Ilara sat, her heart pounding despite her best efforts to remain outwardly composed. "What is this about, my lord?" "This," Thorn said, producing a folded document and sliding it across the table toward her, "is an order of expulsion, effective immediately, removing you from Blackthorn's protection, and requiring your departure from these lands within the day." Ilara's blood ran cold. "On what grounds?" "Endangerment of pack security," Thorn said smoothly, "through repeated, unauthorized contact with a confined and unpredictable threat, in direct violation of explicit council orders. This council has shown considerable patience with your continued presence here, Alara Voss. That patience has now reached its limit." "You cannot do this," Ilara said, fear giving way to sharp anger. You know the bond between myself and the king is real. Odette has confirmed it. Expelling me will not erase that truth. Something flickered across Thorne's carefully composed expression, brief and cold. I know a great many things, Ilara Voss. I know, for instance, that a true mate bond, once formed, does not simply fade with distance, regardless of how many miles separate the two people involved, which means this council need not concern itself further with your immediate proximity to prevent whatever danger your presence poses. Distance will suffice just as effectively. The calculated cruelty in his words struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. He intended to separate them permanently, banking on the belief that even a bond strong enough to defy silver could not survive the simple, practical distance of exile. He will not accept this, Ilara said, though her voice trembled with the effort of maintaining her composure. The king will never accept you sending me away. The king, Thorne said, rising from his chair with slow, deliberate authority, remains chained within a stone chamber, Ilara Voss. Whatever his personal wishes on this matter, this council retains full authority over decisions regarding this pack's security, at least until he demonstrates the control necessary to reclaim that authority for himself. And given his continued confinement, I suspect that demonstration remains a very long way off indeed. You poisoned him, Ilara said suddenly, the words escaping before caution could stop them. 7 years ago, you poisoned that wine, and you have kept him chained ever since to protect the power you built in his absence. The chamber fell utterly silent. Thorne's expression did not change, though something dangerous flickered behind his careful eyes, confirming, in that brief, unguarded moment, everything Ilara had suspected without ever needing him to speak a word of admission. That, Thorne said finally, his voice dropping to something cold and quiet, is a very serious accusation, Ilara Voss, made without any proof this council would ever recognize as legitimate. I would advise you, quite strongly, against repeating such claims to anyone else, during whatever time remains before your departure. Accusations of that nature tend to have consequences for those foolish enough to voice them without sufficient standing to be believed. The threat, though carefully veiled, was unmistakable. Ilara understood, with sudden clarity, exactly how far Thorne was prepared to go to protect the position he had built over 7 careful years, and exactly how little her own safety would matter to him, should she continue pressing against the boundaries of his control. Guards will escort you to gather your belongings, Thorne continued, his composure fully restored, as though the brief flash of confirmation moments before had never occurred at all. You will be beyond Blackthorn's borders before nightfall. I trust you understand the wisdom of accepting this outcome quietly, for your own sake, and for the sake of anyone foolish enough to have assisted you thus far. Ilara was escorted from the room in a daze, her mind racing through every possible course of action, even as the guards guided her firmly back toward the servants' quarters, to collect what few belongings she owned. Word of her expulsion spread quickly through the castle, and by the time she reached her small chamber, Dessa was already waiting, her expression a mixture of fury and heartbreak. This is not right, Dessa said fiercely, helping Ilara gather her few possessions with hands that trembled with barely restrained anger. Thorne cannot simply cast aside a confirmed bond because it threatens his comfortable authority. There must be something that can be done. I do not know what, Ilara admitted, her own hands shaking as she folded her few garments into a worn satchel. He has already threatened consequences for anyone who assists me further. I cannot ask you, or Talia, or anyone else, to risk what I have already risked. You did not choose this bond, Dessa said fiercely. You did not choose any of this. And I will not simply stand aside and watch injustice unfold beneath my own roof without at least attempting to do something. Word reached Garrick within the hour, delivered breathlessly by young Finn, who had overheard enough of the council's discussion to understand the gravity of what had occurred. Garrick's expression darkened considerably as Finn relayed the details, the calculated cruelty of Thorne's plan to separate Ilara from Kellen through simple, practical distance rather than direct confrontation. We must tell the king, Garrick said immediately, already moving toward the West Wing staircase with Finn close behind. Whatever the risk, he deserves to know before she is gone entirely. They found Kellen already tense with unease, the bond within him straining sharply enough to have alerted him that something had gone terribly wrong, long before Garrick delivered the full account of Thorne's actions. He cannot do this, Kellen said, rising sharply despite the chains that immediately pulled taut against the movement, gold flickering dangerously in his eyes for the first time in weeks. Alara has done nothing to deserve exile. This is retaliation, plain and simple, for evidence we have gathered against him. What would you have us do, my king? Garrick asked carefully, watching the barely contained fury building visibly within Kellen's controlled exterior. We do not yet possess proof strong enough to bring formal charges against Thorn before the council, and any attempt to physically prevent her expulsion risks confirming every fear this council has held about your control for 7 long years. Kellen closed his eyes, drawing on every reserve of hard-won patience he had built through years of careful discipline, though the effort visibly cost him. Then we must find another way, he said finally, his voice tight with barely restrained emotion. I will not simply allow her to be sent away, while I remain chained here, powerless to stop it. There may be one option, Garrick said slowly, an idea forming, even as he spoke it aloud. The chains that hold you here, my king, were placed by your own choice, not by council decree. You have the authority, if you truly believe your control has been restored, to remove them yourself. It would be an unprecedented risk, but it would also be undeniable proof, before the full pack, of exactly what this council has been suppressing these past 7 years. Kellen looked down at the silver chains wrapped tightly around his wrists. 7 years of careful confinement, built upon a guilt he now understood had been engineered by another man's ambition, rather than any true failing of his own control. The decision that had once seemed impossible, now settled over him with sudden, undeniable clarity. Then that is what we will do, Kellen said, determination steadying his voice into something that had not been heard within those chamber walls since before the poisoning had ever occurred. Bring me the key, Garrick. It is time this pack finally saw the truth of who I truly am, chains or no chains, before Thorn's lies cost me everything that matters most. Outside, the sun had begun its slow descent toward the horizon, marking the final hours before Alara's forced departure from Blackthorn. And within the stone chamber that had held him captive for 7 long years, Kellen prepared, for the first time since the chains first closed around his wrists, to finally set himself free. Garrick retrieved the heavy iron key from its hiding place behind a loose stone near the chamber entrance, his hands steady despite the enormity of what he was about to do. He had guarded that key faithfully for 7 years, protecting it as carefully as he protected the king himself, understanding implicitly that its use represented the single greatest risk either of them could take. Once this is done, Garrick said, holding the key just out of reach, giving Kellen one final moment to reconsider. There is no returning to the safety of these chains, my king, not easily. If your control falters, even for a moment, in front of witnesses, it will confirm every fear Thorn has spent 7 years cultivating among the pack. I understand the risk, Kellen said, meeting his old friend's gaze steadily. But I understand something else more clearly now, Garrick. 7 years of chains did not come from any true danger within myself. They came from a lie, carefully constructed by a man who profited from my confinement. I will not allow that lie to cost Alara her safety, her home, or the bond we have both fought so hard to protect. Give me the key. Garrick hesitated only a moment longer before pressing the heavy iron key into Kellen's waiting palm, stepping back to allow him room, as the chains, silent witnesses to 7 years of suffering, finally prepared to fall away. The lock resisted briefly, stiff with years of disuse, before finally giving way with a heavy, grinding click that echoed through the small chamber, like the toll of some great bell marking the end of an era. The cuff around his right wrist fell open, and Kellen drew a slow, careful breath, watching closely for any sign of the uncontrolled surge he had spent 7 years fearing. Nothing happened, beyond the simple, overwhelming relief of freedom finally returning to limbs that had known nothing but restraint for far too long. He unlocked the second cuff with steadier hands, then knelt to release the heavier chains binding his ankles to the stone wall, each click of the lock echoing louder than the last in the tense silence of the chamber. Finn stood frozen near the doorway, watching with wide eyes as the king who had haunted Castle Whispers for 7 years finally rose to his full height, unbound for the first time in longer than the young guard had even served at Blackthorn. Kellen flexed his fingers slowly, testing muscles long accustomed to the restrictive weight of silver chains, feeling the wolf stir gently beneath his skin, present and powerful as it had always been, but fully, undeniably under his own steady control. "How do you feel, my king?" Garrick asked quietly, watching him with careful, searching attention. "Free," Kellen said simply, wonder coloring the single word. "And steady, completely steady, Garrick, for the first time in 7 years." A slow, relieved smile broke across Garrick's weathered face. 7 years of careful worry finally beginning to lift from his own shoulders as well. "Then let us waste no further time," he said. "Ilara's departure draws near, and Thorn will not expect you to leave this chamber, my king. That surprise may be exactly what we need." Kellen moved toward the heavy chamber door, pausing only briefly at the threshold he had not crossed in 7 long years, drawing one final steadying breath before stepping fully into the corridor beyond, into a castle that had long ago given up hope of ever seeing its true king walk freely among them again. Word spread through Blackthorn faster than fire through dry grass. Servants froze mid-task as the king passed, disbelief and wonder mingling openly on faces that had known him only as rumor and legend for 7 long years. Some dropped into hasty bows, others simply stared, unable to fully process the sight of the chained king, walking calmly and steadily through corridors he had not seen in nearly a decade. Kellen paid little attention to the growing commotion behind him, his focus fixed entirely on reaching the outer gates, before Ilara's forced departure could be completed, before Thorn's carefully constructed plan could succeed in separating them through simple, brutal distance. Ahead, near the castle's main courtyard, he could already see the small gathering forming near the gates, guards flanking a familiar figure whose dark hair and worn satchel he would have recognized anywhere, even from this distance, even after everything that had happened. Ilara had nearly reached the threshold of the gate when a sudden ripple of astonished murmurs rolled through the gathered crowd behind her, growing louder and more disbelieving with each passing second. She turned, uncertain what could have caused such a stir, and felt her breath catch entirely in her throat at the sight now approaching steadily across the courtyard. Kellen Vane, Alpha King of Blackthorn, walked toward her unchained, unbound, and utterly, unmistakably in full command of himself, for the first time in 7 long years. The guards flanking Ilara stepped back instinctively, uncertain how to respond to a sight none of them had ever witnessed, their orders from Thorn, suddenly feeling woefully inadequate against the reality of their king standing before them, calm and steady, and radiating an authority that 7 years of confinement had never fully extinguished. "My king," one of them stammered, bowing hastily. "Lord Thorn ordered." "I am aware of what Lord Thorn ordered," Kellen said, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed courtyard, steady and commanding, in a way none of the assembled servants had heard in nearly a decade. "And I am here to inform you that his order is rescinded, effective immediately, by my direct authority, as this pack's rightful king." Ilara stood frozen at the center of it all, tears gathering unbidden in her eyes, as Kellen closed the remaining distance between them, stopping just close enough that the golden warmth of their bond flared brightly between them, visible now not only to the two of them, but to every witness gathered in the courtyard, a soft, unmistakable glow that confirmed, beyond any doubt, exactly what Odette had sensed weeks before. Gasps rippled through the crowd at the sight, servants and guards alike witnessing proof of the ancient bond, made suddenly, undeniably visible. "You came," Ilara whispered, hardly daring to believe the sight before her. "I will always come for you," Kellen said quietly, reaching out to take her hand, the familiar warmth settling instantly between them, despite the very public setting. 7 years, I let a lie keep me chained, keep me from the people I was meant to protect. I will not lose another moment of freedom to that same lie, and I will not lose you, Ilara, not while there is breath left in me to prevent it. Behind them, word of the king's sudden, unchained appearance had already begun racing toward the council chambers, and it would not be long, both of them understood, before Lord Alistair Thorne arrived to confront directly the outcome he had spent 7 careful years working so hard to prevent. For now, though, standing together in the pale afternoon light of the courtyard, surrounded by a pack slowly awakening to the return of their true king, Ilara and Kellen allowed themselves one brief, precious moment of relief, the bond between them glowing steady and bright, proof enough, for anyone watching, that whatever darkness had shaped the past 7 years Something far stronger than silver or scheming had finally broken free. Thorn arrived at the courtyard within minutes, flanked by 4 of his most trusted guards, his composure fraying visibly at the edges, despite his best efforts to maintain the careful authority he had cultivated over 7 long years. "My king," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm. "This is a grave and unnecessary risk. You have not left that chamber in 7 years. Return immediately, before something happens that this council cannot contain." "There is nothing to contain, Lord Thorn," Kellen said, his voice carrying easily across the hushed courtyard, steady and unwavering, in a way that immediately drew every eye present. "My control has never been the danger you have spent 7 years claiming it to be. I suspect you have always known that far better than anyone else present." A tense silence fell over the gathered crowd, servants and guards alike sensing the shift in power occurring before them, though few yet understood its full significance. Thorn's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, the first true crack appearing in 7 years of carefully maintained composure. "I do not know what accusation you are implying," Thorn said carefully, "but this is neither the time nor the place for such discussion. The full council should convene properly, in private, to address whatever concerns have prompted this unprecedented action." "I agree entirely," Kellen said, surprising Thorn with the swift concession. "Let us convene the full council, immediately, in the Great Hall, before every member of this pack who wishes to witness it. I believe it is long past time this pack learned the truth of what happened 7 years ago, and who truly bears responsibility for the chains that held me since." Something flickered dangerously behind Thorn's careful composure, calculation racing visibly behind his eyes as he weighed his rapidly narrowing options. To refuse the king's direct request before so many witnesses would raise suspicion he could ill afford. To accept meant walking directly into whatever evidence Kellen and his allies had gathered against him. "Very well," Thorn said finally, forcing his voice back into careful neutrality. "The Great Hall, within the hour. Though I would caution you, my king, against making unfounded accusations before this pack, based on fragmented memories 7 years old and questionable documents of uncertain origin." "We shall let the evidence speak for itself," Kellen said simply, turning to offer Alara his arm, the golden warmth of their bond still glowing faintly between them as they made their way together toward the Great Hall, followed by a rapidly growing crowd of servants, guards, and curious pack members, eager to witness whatever unfolded next. Within the hour, the Great Hall of Blackthorn Castle, filled to capacity for the first time in 7 years, packed tightly with servants and soldiers, healers and stable hands, every member of the household eager to witness the confrontation that had been building, unseen, for weeks beneath the castle's careful surface. Odette stood near the front of the assembly, the documents she had gathered clutched carefully in her hands, while Garrick and Finn positioned themselves near the king, ready to offer whatever support might prove necessary. Thorn took his customary place at the head of the council table, flanked by the remaining council members, his expression carefully composed once more, though Alara noticed the faint tension still lingering in the set of his shoulders. "Let us begin," Kellen said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed hall, silencing the murmuring crowd immediately. 7 years ago, I lost control during a council gathering in this very castle, resulting in tragedy that has haunted this pack, and haunted me most of all, ever since. I chained myself the following morning, believing wholeheartedly that I posed a danger too great to risk repeating. I have recently learned that belief may have been built upon a lie. Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd at the bold declaration. Thorn's expression remained carefully neutral, though his hands, resting on the table before him, had curled slightly tighter than before. "Present the evidence," Kellen said, turning to Odette. Odette stepped forward, her voice steady, despite the weight of the moment, and laid out before the full assembly everything she had discovered. The merchant's ledger, recording the purchase of a rare herb known for weakening a wolf's control. The careful trail connecting that purchase to intermediaries, with documented ties to Lord Thorn. The timeline matching precisely with the days preceding the fateful gathering 7 years earlier. "This proves nothing conclusively," Thorn said, his voice tight but controlled, when Odette finished speaking. "A merchant's records, intermediaries whose true loyalties were never fully established. This is circumstantial at best, hardly sufficient grounds for the serious accusation being leveled against me." Perhaps not conclusively, on its own, Kellen said. But I recall, with increasing clarity in recent weeks, a voice present in that chamber, before the poison took full effect. A voice I have come to recognize, unmistakably now, as belonging to you, Lord Thorn. Fragmented memories, 7 years faded, offered by a man this very council believed unstable enough to require confinement, Thorn countered sharply. Surely this assembly can see the weakness in relying on such uncertain testimony. A tense silence stretched through the hall, the weight of accusation and denial hanging heavily in the charged air. It was then that Corwin, standing near the back of the assembly where he had positioned himself carefully throughout the proceedings, finally stepped forward, his expression grave but resolute. I can offer testimony that may settle the matter, Corwin said, his voice carrying clearly, despite the visible effort it cost him to speak against the man he had served loyally for so many years. I have served Lord Thorn faithfully for the better part of a decade, and in that time, I witnessed transactions conducted through careful intermediaries. Transactions I now understand were designed specifically to obscure Lord Thorn's direct involvement from official council records. Thorn's composure finally cracked fully at the sight of his own trusted attendant stepping forward against him, cold fury flashing openly across his features for the first time. You dare betray my trust, Corwin, after everything I have provided you these many years? I dare seek the truth, Corwin said steadily, though his voice trembled slightly with the enormity of what he was doing, which I believe, my lord, you abandoned entirely the night you chose your own ambition over the well-being of this pack and its rightful king. The hall erupted into stunned murmurs, the weight of Corwin's testimony landing with far greater force than the documentary evidence alone had managed. Thorn rose sharply from his seat, his careful composure fully abandoned now in the face of mounting evidence he could no longer easily dismiss. This is a conspiracy, Thorn said, his voice rising with barely controlled desperation, orchestrated by a healer, whose unnatural bond with the king clouds his judgment, supported by a disloyal attendant, seeking favor with a returning ruler, and a council seer, whose sympathies have clearly been compromised. I have served this pack faithfully for 7 years, maintaining stability while our king remained unable to rule. This is the thanks I receive for that service. You served yourself, Kellen said, his voice cutting through Thorn's rising desperation with quiet, absolute authority. You poisoned me 7 years ago, engineered the tragedy that followed, and then positioned yourself as the steady hand this pack needed in my absence, all while ensuring that absence continued far longer than any genuine danger ever required. 7 years, Lord Thorn, 7 years of my life, stolen to serve your ambition. You have no proof of poisoning, Thorn snapped, though the desperation in his voice had grown difficult to fully disguise, only fragmented memory and circumstantial documents. Perhaps, Kellen acknowledged, the documents and testimony alone. But there is one piece of evidence you have not yet accounted for, Lord Thorn. Watch closely. Kellen stepped forward, extending both his bare wrists toward the assembled crowd, the skin marked with 7 years of scarring from silver chains, but otherwise steady, controlled, and entirely without the golden flicker of an unstable shift threatening to break free. He held perfectly, undeniably calm before the entire pack, proof enough on its own that whatever danger had justified his confinement 7 years ago no longer existed, if it had ever truly existed at all beyond the poison's temporary influence. 7 years I believed myself broken, Kellen said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. 7 years I accepted chains because I trusted the story this council told me about my own danger. Look at me now, standing before you, unchained, unshifted, entirely in command of myself. If I were truly the danger you claimed, would I stand so steadily before you all in this moment? The hall remained silent, every eye fixed on the king standing calm and unwavering before them, 7 years of carefully cultivated fear crumbling visibly in the face of undeniable proof. Even the remaining council members exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier confidence in Thorn's leadership rapidly giving way to doubt. Thorn's eyes darted around the hall, searching desperately for any remaining support, finding only uncertain, wavering faces, where confident loyalty had stood only moments before. Cornered, his careful composure finally shattered entirely, revealing beneath it the raw, desperate ambition that had driven his actions for 7 long years. I did what was necessary, Thorn said, his voice rising sharply, the confession finally breaking free after 7 years of careful concealment. This pack needed steady leadership, not a young king still finding his footing, prone to the same instabilities that claimed his own father before him. I ensured stability, 7 years of it, while you hid in the dark, unable to rule. You should be thanking me, not condemning me before this entire assembly. Gasps and horrified murmurs swept through the crowded hall at the open confession. 7 years of careful lies, finally laid bare before the very people who had suffered beneath their weight. Alara felt Kellen's hand tighten around her own. 7 years of stolen guilt, finally, fully lifted from his shoulders, in the space of a single, desperate confession. "Seize him," Kellen said quietly, his voice carrying absolute authority, despite its measured calm. "Lord Alistair Thorne stands guilty, by his own admission, of poisoning his king and orchestrating 7 years of unjust confinement. He will face this council's full judgment for that betrayal." Garrick moved swiftly, guards loyal to the true king closing in around Thorne before he could attempt any further desperate action. The former head of the council, stripped in an instant of the careful authority he had built over 7 long years, was led from the great hall in silence, the weight of his own confession settling heavily over the stunned assembly he left behind. For a long moment after Thorne's removal, the great hall remained utterly silent, the enormity of what had just occurred settling slowly over every person present. 7 years of careful lies, 7 years of a pack believing its king too dangerous to trust, all of it unraveling in the space of a single confrontation that few among them would ever forget. It was Bettina, standing near the front of the assembly, who finally broke the silence, her voice trembling with emotion as she stepped forward. "My king," she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. 7 years, I have wondered whether the man I once knew still existed beneath the stories this castle told of him. I am glad, more than I can say, to see that he does." A ripple of agreement passed through the crowd, servants and guards alike finding their voices at last, offering quiet words of relief and welcome that grew steadily louder as the shock of the confrontation began to fade into something closer to celebration. Kellen looked out over the assembled faces, many of whom he barely recognized after 7 years of isolation, and felt something long buried finally begin to stir within his chest, a sense of belonging he had feared lost forever. "There is much work ahead of us," Kellen said, raising his voice to address the full assembly, once the murmurs had quieted enough for him to be heard clearly. 7 years of neglect will not be undone in a single afternoon. The council itself must be rebuilt, with members whose loyalty lies with this pack's well-being, rather than their own ambition. Our borders have suffered from a lack of steady leadership, and I intend to address that failing personally, starting immediately. "What of Lord Thorne?" Someone called from within the crowd, giving voice to the question weighing on many minds. "He will face judgment before a properly reconstituted council," Kellen said, his tone leaving no doubt as to the seriousness with which he intended to handle the matter. "Poisoning a king, orchestrating false imprisonment, and deceiving an entire pack for 7 years are crimes this pack's laws address clearly. He will answer for each of them in turn, with full transparency, so that no doubt remains regarding the truth of what occurred." Odette stepped forward then, addressing the king directly for the first time since the confrontation had concluded. "My king, I owe you an apology for my own silence these past weeks, watching Thorne dismiss the truth of your bond before this council, without speaking against him sooner. I hope, in time, I might earn back whatever trust my hesitation may have cost." "You found the proof that brought this truth to light, Odette," Kellen said gently. "Whatever hesitation came before that, discovery matters far less to me than the courage you eventually showed in pursuing it. This pack will need your gift in the years ahead, now more than ever, if we are to rebuild what 7 years of deception has damaged." Relief passed visibly across Odette's face at the measured, generous response, and she bowed her head in gratitude before stepping back to allow the king to continue addressing the assembly. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, drawn away by the practical business of the castle even amid such extraordinary events, Ilara remained close beside Kellen, watching the transformation unfolding around them with quiet wonder. The man who had spent 7 years believing himself unworthy of trust now stood commanding the full attention and respect of an entire pack, steady and sure, in a way she suspected even he had forgotten he was capable of being. "You did this," she said softly, once the hall had mostly emptied, leaving only Garrick, Finn, Odette, and a handful of trusted guards standing nearby. 7 years of doubt, and you walked out there and reclaimed everything Thorn tried to steal from you. We did this, Kellen corrected gently, turning to face her fully, the golden warmth of their bond glowing steadily between them, even in the quiet aftermath of the confrontation. None of this would have been possible without you, Alara. Your courage that very first night, walking into a chamber everyone warned you to avoid, set every part of this in motion. I owe you a debt I do not know how I could ever fully repay. You owe me nothing, Alara said, reaching up to gently touch his face, marveling still at the simple, uncomplicated ease of the gesture, freely given and freely received, without chains or walls, or 7 years of careful distance standing between them. I only wanted to help someone in pain. I never imagined it would lead to this. Garrick cleared his throat quietly nearby, a faint, knowing smile touching his weathered features as he watched the two of them together. My king, if I may, the castle will need to see its ruler settle back into his duties swiftly, to fully restore the confidence this pack requires moving forward. But I do not believe anyone present would object to allowing you both a single evening first, simply to breathe, after everything that has finally been set right today. Kellen glanced at Garrick with genuine gratitude, 7 years of loyal service finally rewarded with the sight of his king restored fully to himself. Thank you, old friend, for everything. I do not believe I could have survived these 7 years, or found my way through these past months, without your steady support beside me. It has been the honor of my life to serve you, my king, Garrick said simply, chained or unchained. I am only glad to see you standing as you were always meant to stand. In a small holding cell beneath the eastern tower, far removed from the grandeur of the council chambers he had commanded for 7 years, Thorn sat alone in the gathering darkness, the weight of his own confession settling over him with growing clarity. He had told himself, for 7 long years, that his actions served a greater purpose, that the pack's stability under his steady hand outweighed whatever cost had been paid by a single confined king. Sitting now in the cold silence of confinement himself, that carefully constructed justification felt increasingly hollow, unable to withstand the simple truth of what he had done. Odette came to see him briefly, before the night grew too late, standing just beyond the cell's iron bars, her expression carrying more sorrow than triumph, despite everything that had occurred. Why did you come? Thorn asked, not looking up from where he sat. I served beside you for 7 years, Alistair, Odette said quietly. I believed, for most of that time, that you acted in this pack's genuine interest. I find myself struggling now to reconcile that belief with the truth you finally admitted today. Ambition and duty rarely announce themselves as separate things, Thorn said, a bitter edge creeping into his voice. I convinced myself so thoroughly of the latter that I no longer recognized the former, not until it was far too late to turn back from the path I had chosen. That is not an excuse, Odette said. No, Thorn agreed quietly. It is not. I do not offer it as one. I only offer it as the truth of how a man convinces himself, slowly, over 7 long years, that a lie has become something closer to necessity. Odette said nothing further, turning instead to leave him alone with the consequences of his own choices, the cell door closing behind her with a heavy, final sound that echoed briefly through the quiet stone corridor, before fading into silence. Elsewhere in the castle, word of the day's extraordinary events had already begun spreading far beyond Blackthorn's walls, carried by messengers dispatched to neighboring settlements and border outposts, informing them of the true king's restoration and the treachery that had kept him confined for 7 long years. Among the reports that returned in the following days was troubling news that the raider activity along the northern border, the very activity Thorn had traveled to address only weeks earlier, had grown bolder still in the confusion surrounding the council's sudden upheaval. Garrick brought the reports to Kellen the following morning, finding the king already awake and reviewing older council records with a focus that suggested 7 years of enforced idleness had done nothing to dull his capacity for governance. The border settlements report increased raids these past several days, Garrick said, laying the messenger's account before him. It seems word of yesterday's confrontation reached them even faster than we anticipated, and some among the raiding parties may see this moment of transition as an opportunity to press their advantage before Blackthorn's leadership fully stabilizes. Kellen studied the reports carefully, old instincts sharpening quickly despite 7 years of disuse. "Then we cannot afford to delay in demonstrating this pack's continued strength," he said. "Gather what remains of the loyal council, Garrick. We have much to discuss, and precious little time in which to discuss it, if we are to protect our people from those who would take advantage of this transition." "And Alara?" Garrick asked carefully. "Will she be included in these discussions?" Kellen looked up, something warm and certain settling behind his eyes, despite the gravity of the border reports before him. "Alara will be beside me for everything that follows, Garrick. In this, and in all matters going forward. That much, at least, is no longer in question." That evening, as the last light of day faded over Blackthorn Castle, Kellen and Alara walked together through the courtyard for the first time, free of chains, free of secrecy, free of the careful boundaries that had shaped every previous moment they had shared. The pack around them buzzed with quiet excitement and disbelief, servants and guards alike still processing the extraordinary events of the day, but for the two of them, walking slowly beneath a sky finally clearing of winter clouds, the world felt, for the first time in longer than either could remember, genuinely, hopefully new. The reconstituted council convened 3 days later, its membership carefully rebuilt from among those whose loyalty to Blackthorn's genuine well-being had never wavered, even during the long years of Thorn's careful manipulation. Odette remained, her earlier hesitation forgiven, in light of the crucial evidence she had eventually brought to light. Garrick joined as well, his years of quiet loyalty finally recognized, with a formal seat at the table he had protected so faithfully from the shadows. Bettina, respected throughout the castle for her wisdom and steady judgment, accepted a position representing the interests of the pack's healers and common households. Their first order of business addressed the growing threat along the northern border, where raiding parties had grown increasingly bold in the confusion following Thorn's exposure. Kellen, drawing on instincts sharpened rather than dulled by 7 years of careful, forced patience, organized a swift and decisive response, personally leading a contingent of guards to the border settlements, to demonstrate, beyond any doubt, that Blackthorn's strength remained fully intact, despite the recent upheaval within its own walls. Alara insisted on accompanying the group, her healing skills proving invaluable when a brief skirmish left several guards injured during a tense confrontation, with raiders testing the border's defenses. She worked tirelessly through that long night, tending wounds with the same steady competence that had first drawn Kellen's notice all those months ago, while Kellen himself fought alongside his guards for the first time in 7 years, his control absolute and unwavering, even amid the chaos of battle. By dawn, the raiders had retreated, driven back by a display of strength and unity that made clear to every watching eye that Blackthorn's true king had returned fully to his rightful place, stronger and steadier than the rumors of 7 years' confinement had ever suggested possible. Word of the successful defense spread quickly through the northern territories, restoring confidence among allied packs, who had begun to quietly question Blackthorn's stability during the long years of Thorn's shadow rule. When they returned to the castle a week later, weary but triumphant, they found the formal proceedings against Thorn finally ready to begin. The trial, conducted before the full reconstituted council with careful transparency demanded by Kellen himself, laid bare every detail of the 7-year deception, the poisoning, the careful manipulation of council records, the deliberate prolonging of the king's confinement, long after any genuine danger had passed. Thorn offered no further denial once the proceedings began, his earlier confession before the full pack having already sealed the truth of his guilt beyond any reasonable dispute. He listened in silence as witness after witness came forward, Corwin's careful testimony, Odette's documented evidence, the merchant records tracing the poison's origin directly back to his own carefully hidden transactions. "You had 7 years to come to me," Kellen said quietly, when the council finally called upon him to speak before delivering judgment. 7 years, in which you could have confessed, could have sought whatever forgiveness this pack might have found within itself to offer. Instead, you chose 7 more years of careful lies, 7 more years of watching me suffer for a crime that was never truly mine to answer for. "I know," Thorn said simply, the fight finally gone entirely from his voice. "I convinced myself, for far too long, that the ends justified whatever means I employed. I understand now, sitting here before this council, exactly how hollow that justification always was. The council's judgment, when it came, stripped Thorn of all rank and privilege within Blackthorn, exiling him permanently beyond the pack's protected borders, forbidden ever to return under threat of far harsher consequence. It was, by the standards of pack law, a merciful sentence given the severity of his crimes, tempered by Kellen's own insistence that vengeance served this pack far less than the simple, clear demonstration of justice, finally, properly served. "I do not do this out of forgiveness," Kellen told the assembled council after Thorn had been led away for the final time, his voice carrying quietly but firmly through the chamber. "I do this because a pack rebuilding itself after 7 years of deception deserves to see justice tempered by wisdom, not consumed by the same bitterness that drove Thorn's own ambition. We move forward from here, together, stronger for having finally faced this truth openly." Far beyond Blackthorn's borders, in a small, unremarkable settlement where no one recognized the name he now carried, Thorn began the long, uncertain work of rebuilding a life stripped of every privilege he had once commanded. He spoke to no one of his past, accepted whatever quiet labor a stranger without connections could find, and spent his solitary evenings turning over the same question, again and again, wondering whether 7 years of careful ambition had ever truly been worth the cost of what he had ultimately lost. It was not forgiveness he found in that quiet exile, not yet, but it was, perhaps, the beginning of an honest reckoning he had avoided for far too long. Back within Blackthorn's walls, life continued its steady return to warmth and stability. The weeks that followed brought steady, welcome change to Blackthorn Castle. The council settled into its new rhythm under Kellen's restored leadership, addressing years of neglected concerns with a thoroughness that quickly won back the confidence of a pack that had grown accustomed to quiet uncertainty during the long years of his confinement. Border patrols were strengthened, alliances with neighboring packs carefully renewed, and the castle itself, so long shadowed by rumor and fear, began slowly filling once more with the warmth and openness it had known before the chains. Alara took on a formal role within the healing hall, working alongside Bettina to establish proper training for a new generation of healers, ensuring that no injury or illness within the castle would ever again go improperly treated as Kellen's own wounds had for so many years. Her days grew full with purpose, her nights no longer spent slipping secretly through darkened corridors, but rather shared openly with the man whose bond had changed both their lives so completely. It was on a clear, bright morning some months later, with the last traces of winter finally giving way to the first green signs of spring across the northern territories, that Kellen called the full pack together once more in the Great Hall, this time for a purpose far different from the tense confrontation that had unfolded there months before. The hall, decorated simply but beautifully, with early spring blooms gathered from the castle gardens, filled quickly with familiar faces, Dessa beaming proudly near the kitchen staff she had long overseen, Talia standing close beside her, Finn now formally promoted within Garrick's ranks, after his quiet courage during the difficult weeks of investigation, Odette and the rest of the reconstituted council, seated with quiet dignity near the front of the assembly. Kellen stood at the head of the hall, dressed simply, but with a bearing that spoke clearly of a king fully restored to his rightful confidence, watching as Alara made her way toward him through the gathered crowd, her dark hair adorned with a simple circlet of spring flowers, her expression bright with a joy that had been a long, difficult journey in the making. 7 years ago, Kellen said, addressing the assembled pack once the hall had settled into attentive silence, I believed myself broken beyond any hope of redemption, chained not only by silver, but by a guilt I now understand was never truly mine to carry. I might have remained in that darkness indefinitely, had one person not shown the courage to reach toward me, when everyone else, myself included, believed such courage would only end in harm. He turned to face Alara directly, taking her hands gently in his own, the familiar golden warmth of their bond glowing softly between them, visible now not as a startling revelation before a frightened crowd, but as a celebrated, joyful truth witnessed by a pack that had come to understand and honor exactly what it represented. Ilara Voss, Kellen said, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly evident beneath it, you touched chains that had burned every hand before yours, not because you sought power or position, but because you could not walk away from someone in pain. You freed me long before I ever understood I needed freeing, and you have stood beside me through every difficult step since, asking for nothing in return beyond the simple chance to help. I would be honored, before this entire pack, to name you not only my true mate, but my Luna, my equal in leading this pack forward into whatever future awaits us." Alara's eyes filled with tears. 7 years of the castle's sorrow, and months of her own quiet courage, culminating in a moment she had never dared to fully imagine during those first frightened nights of her arrival at Blackthorn. "I never came looking for a king," she said softly, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "I only wanted to help someone who was suffering. I found, instead, the truest bond I could have ever imagined, and a purpose far greater than I ever believed my life could hold. I accept, Kellen, gladly, and with my whole heart." The great hall erupted into joyful celebration. 7 years of quiet suffering finally giving way to a future bright, with restored hope and genuine partnership. Dessa wept openly with happiness, Talia cheering loudly beside her, while Garrick and Finn exchanged proud, relieved smiles, having witnessed firsthand the long, difficult journey that had led to this triumphant moment. Later, as the celebration settled into quieter conversation and shared food across long tables set up throughout the hall, Garrick raised a cup toward the newly named king, and Luna, his weathered face bright with a rare, unguarded happiness. "To 7 years of patience finally rewarded," he said, his voice carrying warmly across the gathered crowd, "and to a bond that proved stronger than any chain this pack ever forged. I have served this castle through its darkest years, and I can say, without any doubt, that I have never been prouder to call Blackthorn my home than I am this very evening." The assembled pack raised their own cups in answering celebration, the sound of genuine laughter and warm conversation filling a hall that had known too many years of tense silence and careful whispers. Alara found herself surrounded by well-wishers throughout the remainder of the evening, servants she had worked alongside during her earliest, uncertain days, at the castle now embracing her as their Luna, with open, genuine affection, while Kellen watched with quiet pride, 7 years of isolation finally giving way to the full warmth of a community he had feared, for so long, he might never fully rejoin. As the celebration continued around them, Kellen drew Alara close, the golden warmth of their completed bond settling over them both, like a promise finally, fully realized. 7 years I spent believing myself untouchable, he murmured softly, just for her to hear, amid the joyful noise surrounding them. "You proved, from that very first night, exactly how wrong that belief had always been. You were never truly untouchable," Alara said, smiling up at him with the same steady warmth that had first drawn her down that forbidden staircase so many months before. "You were only waiting, Kellen, for someone brave enough, or perhaps simply stubborn enough, to reach for you anyway." Later that evening, once the celebration had quieted and most of the pack had retired to their own homes still buzzing with the joyful news, Kellen and Alara walked together down the familiar staircase toward the west wing, a journey neither had expected to make again once the chains had fallen away for good. The chamber remained largely as it had been, torch brackets still mounted along damp stone walls, though the heavy iron cuffs and the length of silver chain had long since been removed, leaving only bare wall where 7 years of confinement had once held him fast. "I asked Garrick to leave it standing for now," Kellen said quietly, running his fingers along the cold stone where the chains had once been fixed. "I did not want to forget, entirely, what this place once meant, both the pain of it and the strange gift it eventually brought me. Do you think you will ever come down here again, once the memory grows easier to carry?" Alara asked, watching him carefully. "Perhaps," Kellen said, turning to face her fully, the golden warmth of their bond glowing steadily in the dim torchlight, exactly as it had that very first night, though the fear that once accompanied it had long since given way to simple, settled joy. "Though I suspect I will remember it less as a prison from this point forward, and more as the place where everything truly began. This is where you found me, Alara, frightened, chained, convinced I was beyond any hope of rescue, and you walked through that door anyway." "I would walk through it again," Alara said softly, 1,000 times over, if it meant finding my way back to you. Kellen drew her close. The chamber that had once echoed with 7 years of solitary suffering, now filled instead with quiet warmth and the soft, steady glow of a bond that had proven, in the end, far stronger than any silver ever forged to contain it. Outside, spring continued its steady march across the northern territories, green shoots pushing up through soil that had known nothing but frozen silence for far too long. much like the pack itself, slowly, steadily awakening from 7 long years of quiet suffering into a future finally, truly free. And within the great hall of Blackthorn Castle, and within the small stone chamber that had once held its king captive, the story that had begun with a single, fearless touch in the darkness finally found its truest, most hopeful ending, not merely in chains broken, but in a bond forged strong enough to outlast them entirely, carrying both Kellen and Alara forward into a future neither had ever dared to imagine possible during those long, difficult years of separation and doubt.